The rain had stopped 3 hours before dawn, but the mud along County Road 47 still grabbed at truck tires like it had something to prove. Wyatt Sullivan sat in his 1972 Ford F-150, windows down, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. He was staring at a fence line that used to mark where his father's land began. Used to. That was the part that made his jaw tight. It was November 1981, 10 years since they buried Thomas Sullivan. 10 years since three brothers stood in a barn and divided 40 years of a man's life like they were dealing cards. And Wyatt, sitting there at 44 years old with grease still under his fingernails from rebuilding a hydraulic pump the night before, was trying to remember the exact moment he'd understood what his father had really meant when he wrote that strange line in his will. The gear stays with the land. Or it stays together. Split one, you split all, but don't split what's meant to work as one. Nobody had known what the hell that meant back in 1971. Not Cole, not Garrett, and not Wyatt himself. But 10 years later, with 420 acres unified under the Sullivan name again, with two brothers working beside him instead of against him, Wyatt thought maybe he was starting to understand. Maybe his father had known all along that the test wasn't in the dividing. It was in the coming back together. He lit a cigarette, the same brand he'd smoked since he was 19, and watched the sun come up over what used to be the east pasture. The light hit the corn stubble first, then crept across the machinery shed where a 1966 John Deere 4020 sat waiting for its fourth rebuild in 15 years. That tractor had been his father's pride. Now it was his burden and his teacher, the thing that had taught him more about patience and persistence than any man ever could. Wyatt started the truck and pulled back onto the county road, heading toward home. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But before there was this work, before there was the unified farm and the shared equipment and the two brothers who'd learned to set their pride down long enough to pick each other up, there was June of 1971. There was a funeral. There was a barn full of grief and greed and confusion. And there was a choice that everyone called foolish, but that turned out to be the only choice that mattered. 10 years ago, they'd buried their father. Today, in a way, they'd finally buried their pride. But it started with the funeral, June 15th, 1971. The heat that day was the kind that made the air shimmer over the blacktop, the kind that turned a dark suit into a punishment. Thomas Sullivan's casket sat at the front of St. Michael's Church, covered with an American flag from his service in Korea, and three men stood around it representing three different ideas of what their father had wanted them to be. Cole Sullivan, 37 years old, stood at the head of the casket. His suit was black and pressed sharp, his jaw set in that way he had when he was trying not to show what he was feeling. Cole was the oldest, the one who'd stayed on the farm through high school and into his 20s while his brothers went off to college in the service. He'd worked beside Thomas for 15 years, learning every field, every fence line, every secret the land kept about where it flooded and where it drained and where you could push it hard and where you had to let it rest. In Cole's mind, that meant something. That meant the farm was his by right, by sweat, by the simple fact that he'd been there when it mattered. Garrett Sullivan, 33, stood off to the side near the windows, his eyes red but dry. Garrett had always been the smart one, the one with ideas bigger than Iowa could hold. He'd gone to Iowa State, studied agricultural economics, came back with his head full of efficiency ratios and market projections and all the ways the old methods were killing small farms. He loved his father. That wasn't the question. But he didn't love farming, not the way Thomas had, not the way Cole did. Garrett saw the land as an asset, a thing that could be converted to capital, transformed into something more mobile, more modern, more in line with where the world was heading. He'd already made up his mind before the funeral started. He was getting out. And then there was Wyatt, 29 years old, kneeling beside the casket with his hand resting on the wood like he was trying to feel his father's heartbeat one more time. Wyatt had gone into the Army right out of high school, served 4 years as a mechanic, came back with skills that didn't seem to fit anywhere in particular. He could tear down an engine and build it back better than it started. He could look at a broken piece of equipment and see not just what was wrong, but why it had broken and how to keep it from breaking again. Thomas had recognized that gift, had spent the last 3 years teaching Wyatt everything he knew about keeping the old iron running, about why a 1952 Farmall M that you maintained right was worth 10 new tractors you couldn't fix yourself. Wyatt had a wife now, Beth, 27 and 5 months pregnant with their first child. She sat in the front pew wearing a black dress that was getting tight around the middle, her hand resting on her belly, watching her husband grieve in that quiet way he had. Beth taught third grade at Riverside Elementary, made $320 a month, and had a mind for numbers that would have made her a good accountant if accountants in 1971 Iowa had been willing to hire women. She watched Wyatt's hand on the casket and knew what he was thinking. He was thinking about the last conversation he had had with his father, 3 days before the heart attack took him in the middle of the night. They'd been in the equipment shed rebuilding the carburetor on the John Deere 4020, and Thomas had said something Wyatt hadn't understood at the time. Son, when I'm gone, your brothers are going to want to split everything clean. That's natural. That's what people do. But I'm telling you right now, the land can be divided, but the equipment can't. Not if you want this place to survive. The man who understands that, who's willing to keep the old iron running when everyone else is buying new, that's the man who'll still be farming when the others are gone. Wyatt had nodded, not really getting it, and Thomas had smiled that tired smile he got near the end. You'll figure it out, he'd said. You're the one who listens to what the machinery tells you. Your brothers listen to what people tell them. There's a difference. The funeral ended, and they buried Thomas Sullivan in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the Des Moines River, the same cemetery where his own father was buried, and his father before that. The reception at the house was quiet and stiff, full of neighbors bringing casseroles and offering condolences that sounded the same no matter who said them. By 7 in the evening, everyone had gone home, and the three brothers sat on the porch with their mother, Margaret Sullivan, who everyone called Maggie. She was 62 years old, white-haired and wire-thin, with eyes that missed nothing. She looked at her three sons and said what needed to be said. We meet with the lawyer on Thursday. Your father left a will. It's fair, but it's going to ask something of you boys that you might not want to give. What's that, Ma? Cole asked. Trust, she said, and she went inside, leaving them to think about that. Thursday came. The barn was hot, even with the big doors open, and the light coming through the gaps in the boards made golden stripes across the concrete floor, where oil stains from 50 years of tractors had turned the surface black in patches. The three brothers sat on hay bales while a lawyer named Edmund Price, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase that looked older than he was, spread papers across a workbench that still had Thomas's tools on it. Nobody had moved them yet. Nobody wanted to be the first. Edmund cleared his throat and began reading. I, Thomas Sullivan, being of sound mind and body, leave my estate as follows. To my beloved wife Margaret, the house and 5 acres surrounding it, to live in as long as she wishes. To my 3 sons, Cole, Garrett, and Wyatt, I leave the farm, all 240 acres, to be divided equally among them. 80 acres each. I also leave my equipment, all of it, from the tractors to the tools to the trailer, with the rotted boards I kept meaning to fix. But here's what I need you boys to understand. Edmund paused, looked up at the 3 men, then continued reading in Thomas's words. The land can be split because land is patient. It'll wait for whoever farms it next. But equipment is different. Equipment is knowledge made physical. It's every lesson I learned about keeping things running when parts were scarce and money was tight. It's the proof that value isn't in shine, it's in what holds together under pressure. So here's what I'm asking. Don't split the equipment unless you're willing to split the knowledge that goes with it. And if you are willing to split that, then you never understood what I was trying to teach you in the first place. The gear stays with the land or it stays together. Split one, you split all, but don't split what's meant to work as one. The barn went quiet except for the sound of barn swallows in the rafters and the distant hum of a truck on County Road 47. Cole looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at his hands, at the calluses and the scars and the permanence of grease under his nails. Edmund folded the paper and pulled out another document. There's more. Your father had the farm and equipment appraised last year. The land is worth approximately $300 an acre, so 80 acres comes to $24,000 per person. The equipment, all of it together, is appraised at $20,700. If divided equally, that's $6,900 each in equipment value. He looked at the brothers over his glasses. Your father's will states that you can divide the land how you see fit, but the equipment must either stay together with one person or be sold and the proceeds divided. You cannot split the physical equipment. It's all or nothing. Cole spoke first, like he usually did. That's simple then. We divide the land 3 ways, sell the equipment, split the cash. Everyone starts clean. Garrett nodded. I agree. I'm not planning to stay anyway. I'll take my 80 acres, my share of the equipment money, and I'll sell the land within 2 years. I've got opportunities in Des Moines, things that make more sense than fighting this dirt for 40 years like Dad did. Cole's face went hard. You're going to sell your piece? You're going to take what Dad built and just convert it to cash? Garrett met his eyes. He left it to me to do with what I want, and what I want is out. Cole stood up like he might take a swing, but Wyatt's voice cut through, quiet and steady. Sit down, Cole. Cole sat, but his jaw was working, his fists clenched. Wyatt looked at Edmund. What's the breakdown on the equipment? Piece by piece. Edmund consulted his papers. One John Deere 4020 tractor, 1966 model, 95 horsepower, needs engine rebuild, appraised at $8,000. One from All M tractor, 1952 model, 36 horsepower, runs but underpowered, appraised at $3,500. One International grain drill, 1958, moderate rust, $1,200. One disc harrow, homemade, circa 1945, heavy wear, $400. One New Holland hay baler, 1963, mechanism jams, 2000. One livestock trailer, 1959, wood bed rot, 600. And a complete workshop of tools, welders, lathes, hand tools, 50 years accumulated, estimated at $5,000. He looked up. Total, $20,700. Sold as a lot, you'd be lucky to get $18,000. Sold piece by piece at auction, maybe 22 if the buyers are generous. Cole leaned back. So we sell it, get maybe $7,000 each, and we're done. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over the list Edmund had read. The John Deere 4020. He'd helped his father rebuild that engine once already, back in 1968. It had thrown a rod, cracked the block, and everyone said it was junk. But Thomas had found a used block at a salvage yard in Waterloo, spent 3 months teaching Wyatt how to swap it, how to set the timing, how to gap the rings just right so it wouldn't burn oil. When they'd finished, that tractor ran smoother than it had when it was new. Wyatt had been 17. It was the first time he'd understood that broken didn't mean worthless. It just meant you hadn't learned how to fix it yet. The Farmall M. That was the tractor Thomas had bought in 1952, the year Wyatt was born. It had been old even then, but it was simple. No computers, no emissions, just iron and diesel, and a governor you could adjust with a wrench. Thomas had used it to teach all 3 boys how to drive, how to plow, how to feel when the engine was straining and when it was loafing. It didn't have the power of the newer machines, but it had something else. It had patience. And the tools, God, the tools. Wyatt could close his eyes and draw a map of that workshop, could tell you where every socket wrench hung, which drawer had the feeler gauges, where his father kept the good welding rods he saved for cast iron repairs. Those tools were an education. They were the nights he'd spent watching Thomas fix things by lamplight, the quiet lessons about why you didn't force a bolt, why you cleaned threads before you reassembled, why good work took time and shortcuts took longer. Wyatt looked at Edmund. I'll take the equipment, all of it. The barn went still. Cole turned. What? Wyatt kept his eye on Edmund. I'll take all the equipment instead of cash. Cole and Garrett can split my $6,900 between them. That gives them each an extra $3,450 on top of their land. Garrett stared. You're turning down almost $7,000 to take a bunch of broken tractors and rusty tools? Wyatt finally looked at his brothers. I'm taking what Dad wanted someone to take. You two can have the money. I'll have the iron. Cole's face went from confusion to something like disgust. You're going to take the worst land, the junk equipment, and you think you can make a living? Wyatt stood up. I'll take the 80 acres on the north end, the low ground near the river. The land that floods in spring, the land you've been complaining about for 10 years, Cole. You and Garrett can split the good dirt down south and in the middle. 160 of prime ground, plus almost $14,000 in cash. I'll take 80 acres of bottomland and all of Dad's old gear. Edmund looked at him carefully. Mr. Sullivan, I need to make sure you understand what you're doing. You're choosing land that's been designated as flood-prone, that has 20% lower yield on average, and you're taking equipment that needs extensive repair instead of cash that could buy you new equipment. Are you certain? Wyatt picked up a crescent wrench from the workbench, one with tape on the handle where his father had wrapped it to get a better grip. He turned it over in his hands. I'm certain. Cole stood up, shaking his head. You're making a mistake, Wyatt. A stupid, stubborn mistake. But if you want to fail on your own, I'm not going to stop you. Garrett was quieter, but his voice had an edge. When you realize you can't make it work, don't come asking for help. This is your choice. Wyatt met their eyes one after the other. It is my choice, and I'm making it. Edmund gathered his papers, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. I'll draw up the division documents. Cole, Garrett, you'll each receive 80 acres from the southern and central parcels, plus $6,900 from the equipment valuation. Wyatt, you'll receive the northern 80 acres and full ownership of all farm equipment and tools. Is this agreement acceptable to all parties? Cole nodded. Fine. Garrett nodded. Fine. Wyatt set the wrench back down on the workbench exactly where it had been. Fine. The meeting ended. They walked out of the barn into the afternoon sun, and for the first time in their lives, the three Sullivan brothers were walking in different directions. Cole headed toward the house to tell his wife they'd have money to buy new equipment, that they'd be farming the good land, that this was going to work. Garrett headed to his truck, already thinking about real estate agents, about what 80 acres would sell for in 2 years if land prices kept climbing the way they had been. And Wyatt walked toward the equipment shed, toward the 1952 Farmall M that was sitting there with flat tires and a fuel system that hadn't been touched in 8 months. Beth found him there an hour later. She was showing now, her belly round under a cotton dress, and she moved carefully through the cluttered shed to where Wyatt sat on an overturned bucket, just looking at the tractor. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there with her hand on her stomach, waiting. Finally, Wyatt spoke. I turned down almost $7,000. I know, Beth said, to take a bunch of broken machines. I know. Everyone thinks I'm crazy. Beth sat down on a hay bale nearby, as close as her belly would let her get comfortable. Are you crazy? Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Maybe. But Dad said something to me before he died. He said the man who keeps the old iron running is the man who will still be farming when the others are gone. I didn't understand it then, but I think I do now. He looked at her. Cole's going to buy new, shiny red tractors with all the power, all the features. He's going to borrow money to do it, because that's what you do now. You leverage, you expand, you modernize, and maybe it'll work for him. Maybe he'll make it. What about Garrett? Garrett's already gone. He's just waiting for the paperwork to make it official. Beth was quiet, then asked the question she'd been holding. And us? Wyatt stood up, walked over to the Farmall M, put his hand on the hood. The metal was cool even in the June heat. The green paint faded to almost gray in places. The tin work dented from decades of use. Us? We're going to do what Dad did. We're going to take what everyone else thinks is junk, and we're going to make it run. We're going to fix what's broken, maintain what's working, and refuse to believe that new is better just because it's new. He looked at Beth. I know we don't have much money. I know the land I chose is the worst of the three pieces. I know that tractor right there needs 3 months of work before it'll even start. But I also know that if I can make this work, if I can prove that the old ways still have value, then our kid is going to grow up learning something important. What's that? That you don't measure a man by what he buys, you measure him by what he can fix. Beth stood up, walked over, took his hand. Then we better get started fixing. That night, Wyatt sat at their kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, making lists. Beth sat across from him, her accounting ledger open, doing the math he hated. We have $1,200 in savings, she said. The baby's due in 4 months. Hospital bill will be around $700, maybe more if there are complications. Wyatt wrote that down. Seed for next spring. If I plant 40 acres of corn and 30 of soybeans, that's about $2,200 in seed costs. Beth wrote it in her ledger. Fertilizer and chemicals? I'm going to try to go lighter on those. Use rotation. Let some fields rest. Dad always said the ground will tell you what it needs if you listen, but figure another 1,500. That's 4,400 before we even start, Beth said. We don't have that. I can get a spring operating loan from the co-op. 3,000 at 8%, due after harvest. Beth made a note. That gives us $720 in interest if we pay it back in October. What about equipment repair? Wyatt looked at his list. The Farmall M needs new tires, a fuel system cleaning, probably new injectors. I can do the labor, but parts are going to run $450, maybe $500. The John Deere 4020, that's the big one. Engine rebuild. If I do it myself, I'm looking at 2,400 in parts, maybe more. Beth looked up. Wyatt, we can't afford that right now. I know. That's why the 4020 stays parked until I can save enough. I'll do everything with the Farmall M the first year. It's smaller, slower, but it'll get the job done. What if it breaks down? Then I fix it. That's what I do. Beth closed her ledger, looked at him across the table. The lamplight made her face soft, but her eyes were serious. Everyone in town is going to call you crazy. You know that, right? Cole's going to be driving around in a brand new tractor, and you're going to be puttering along in something that's almost 20 years old. People are going to talk. Let them talk. And when the baby comes, and we're scraping by, and you're working 18-hour days trying to keep that old tractor running, are you going to regret this? Wyatt reached across the table, took her hand. The only thing I'd regret is taking the easy way and then looking back and wondering if I could have done it different. I'd rather fail doing it the way Dad taught me than succeed doing it the way everyone else says I should. Beth squeezed his hand. Okay, then let's fail together if we're going to fail. But let's not fail because we didn't try hard enough. That became their motto, spoken or unspoken, through the rest of that summer and into the fall. Let's not fail because we didn't try hard enough. While Cole was at the John Deere dealership in Iowa City, signing papers for a brand new 1971 Model 4430 with 125 horsepower and a price tag of $28,000 that made the salesman's eyes light up, Wyatt was in his shed with the Farmall M, draining the fuel tank that had turned to varnish, pulling the injectors one by one, learning the patience it took to clean 30 years of carbon without damaging the precision machine tips. While Garrett was in Des Moines meeting with a real estate speculator named Richard Brennan, who'd made a fortune buying up farmland and converting it to commercial use, Wyatt was lying on his back under the Farmall, changing oil that came out black and thick as syrup, checking every bearing, every seal, looking for the small problems before they became big ones. And while both his brothers were moving forward into what they thought was the future, Wyatt was moving backward into what his father had known all along. That the future wasn't in what you bought, it was in what you could keep running. By September, the legal papers were signed. Cole Sullivan owned 80 acres of the best farmland in the southern section, plus $6,900 in cash that he immediately used as a down payment on his new tractor and a grain truck. He took out loans for the rest, $40,000 total at 8.5% interest. His payment schedule called for $5,800 a year for 10 years. It was aggressive, but Cole was confident. With that new equipment, he could farm more efficiently, get higher yields, maybe even lease some additional ground from neighbors. He was 37 years old and he was done being patient. It was time to build something. Garrett Sullivan owned 80 acres of the middle section, plus his $6,900 in cash. He did exactly what he said he would. He kept the money, didn't buy any equipment, and started making calls to Richard Brennan about the best time to sell. Brennan told him to wait. Land prices are going up, he said. Give it 2 years and that 80 acres will be worth 35, maybe 40% more. Garrett could wait. He was good at waiting when money was involved. And Wyatt Sullivan owned 80 acres of the worst farmland in the northern section, the ground that sat low and flooded every spring when the Des Moines River rose, the dirt that stayed wet too long in April and dried out too fast in August. Plus, he owned one 1966 John Deere 4020 that didn't run, one 1952 Farmall M that barely ran, one grain drill that looked like it had been pulled out of a lake, one homemade disc harrow that was more rust than metal, one hay baler that jammed every third bale, one livestock trailer with a rotted wood bed, and a workshop full of tools that most people would have thrown away 30 years ago. He also owned exactly $0 in debt. And in 1971, that made him the poorest and the richest of the three brothers, depending on how you counted. The first Sunday after the division, Maggie Sullivan invited all three sons and their families for dinner. It was tradition, something Thomas had insisted on, that no matter what happened during the week, Sunday dinner was family time. Maggie had made pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans from her garden, and an apple pie that filled the house with the smell of cinnamon and butter. Cole came with his wife, a quiet woman named Sarah who taught piano lessons and kept her opinions to herself. Garrett came alone. He'd been seeing a woman in Des Moines, but it wasn't serious, he said. And Wyatt came with Beth, who was 7 months along now and moving slow, her hand always on her belly like she was protecting something precious. They sat around the table that had been in that house for 40 years, the same table where Thomas had taught his sons to say grace before meals, to chew with their mouths closed, to respect their mother and each other even when they didn't agree. The same rules applied now. Maggie made sure of that. But the silence between the brothers was new. It sat there like a fourth guest, unwelcome and impossible to ignore. Maggie served the food and they ate, and finally, when she couldn't stand it anymore, she set her fork down and looked at her sons. "Your father," she said, "would be ashamed of how you boys are treating each other." Cole looked up. "We're not treating each other anyway, Ma. We divided the farm fair and square. Everyone got their share." "Fair and square," Maggie repeated. "Is that what you call it when you take the best land and leave your brother the flood ground?" Cole's face went hard. "Wyatt chose that land. I didn't force him." Maggie turned to Garrett. "And you're planning to sell to Richard Brennan, aren't you?" Garrett didn't flinch. "I am. It's good business." "Richard Brennan," Maggie said, her voice quiet but sharp as a knife, "is the man your father fought with for 20 years over water rights. The man who tried to dam up the creek that feeds our cattle pond. The man who told everyone in town that Thomas Sullivan was too stubborn to farm modern and too poor to matter. That's who you're selling to." Garrett set his fork down. "Dad's gone, Ma. Those old grudges don't mean anything now." "They mean something to me," Maggie said. "And they meant something to your father." She looked at Wyatt, who hadn't said a word, just kept eating like none of this was about him. "And you," she said, "you took the scraps and the junk, and you think that makes you noble?" Wyatt looked up, surprised. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to. You're sitting there thinking you're the only one who understood what your father wanted, that you're the only one who cares about the old ways. But let me tell you something, son. Your father didn't care about old or new. He cared about what worked. And what worked for him was his boys working together, not tearing each other apart over dirt and metal." The table went quiet. Maggie stood up, started clearing plates even though nobody was finished. "You boys figure out what you're going to do, but don't fool yourselves into thinking you honored your father's memory by splitting his life's work into thirds and going your separate ways. That's not honor. That's just arithmetic." She walked into the kitchen and the three brothers sat there, not looking at each other. Beth was the one who spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Mrs. Sullivan is right." Cole turned to her. "Excuse me?" Beth put her hand on Wyatt's arm, but she was looking at Cole. "She's right. You all made your choices, and maybe they're the choices you had to make. But don't pretend this is what your father wanted. He wanted you to find a way to keep it together. And you didn't even try." Cole's wife, Sarah, touched his hand, a warning, but Cole pulled away. "We tried, Beth. We sat in that barn for 4 hours arguing about it. There was no way to keep it together." "Because you didn't want to," Beth said. "None of you did. Cole, you wanted to be the boss. Garrett, you wanted to be gone. And Wyatt, you wanted to prove you could do it alone. Those are all fine wants, but they're not what your father asked for." Garrett stood up. "I don't have to listen to this." "Then don't," Wyatt said, his first words since Grace. "Go on back to Des Moines, sell the land to Brennan, make your money. But Beth's right, don't pretend Dad would have been proud of it." Garrett grabbed his coat and left. The screen door slammed behind him, and a moment later they heard his truck start up and drive away. Cole stood up too, more slowly. "You think you're better than us, Wyatt? You think taking the junk makes you some kind of hero?" Wyatt met his eyes. "I don't think I'm better than anybody. I just think I'm willing to do the work nobody else wants to do. And maybe that's enough." Cole left too, Sarah following behind him with an apologetic look at Beth. When they were gone, Wyatt and Beth sat alone at the table. Maggie came back from the kitchen, sat down, looked at them both. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" Wyatt asked. "For not teaching you boys better. For letting your father do all the farming talk and not doing enough of the family talk." "You taught us fine, Ma." Maggie shook her head. "A mother's job is to teach her children how to love each other even when it's hard. I don't think I did that." Beth reached across the table, took Maggie's hand. "You did your best. Sometimes people have to learn the hard way." Maggie looked at Wyatt. "You're going to have a hard road, son. Harder than your brothers. But if you can walk it without becoming bitter, without losing who you are, then maybe you'll teach them something they need to learn." "What's that?" "That the old ways aren't about being stubborn. They're about being faithful. Faithful to the work, faithful to the land, faithful to each other. Your father understood that. I hope someday your brothers will too." They finished dinner in quiet, and when Wyatt and Beth left, Maggie stood on the porch watching their truck drive away. She was thinking about Thomas, about the conversations they'd had late at night when he couldn't sleep, When he'd talk about his worries for the boys, his fear that they'd split apart after he was gone. "I tried to tell them," he'd said, "but I don't know if they heard me." "They heard you," Maggie whispered to the empty porch. At least one of them did. The fall of 1971 moved into winter, and Wyatt spent every spare hour in the equipment shed. The Farmall M became his obsession and his education. He pulled the fuel tank, cleaned it with acid and rinsing, sealed the rust spots with a product he mail-ordered from a company in Wisconsin. He pulled each injector, soaked them in solvent for 3 days, cleaned them with brushes made from wire. He cut himself, tested each one against a pressure gauge until the spray pattern was perfect. He changed the oil 5 times, flushing the system until the oil came out golden instead of black. He replaced every filter, checked every hose, tested every electrical connection. He pulled the wheels, replaced the tires with used ones he bought from a salvage yard for $30 each, checked the brakes even though the tractor was so slow it barely needed them. Beth would bring him coffee at 10 o'clock at night, find him under the tractor with a trouble light, his hands black with grease, his face streaked with sweat despite the cold. "Come to bed," she'd say. "One more thing," he'd answer. Always one more thing. But slowly, piece by piece, the Farmall M came back to life. On a Saturday morning in December, with the temperature at 15 degrees and frost on every surface, Wyatt climbed into the seat, said a prayer he didn't quite believe in, and turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times, and then it caught. The sound was rough at first, a diesel clatter that shook the whole tractor, but as it warmed up, as the cylinders found their rhythm and the governor smoothed out the idle, it settled into something almost musical. A low, steady thrum that said, "I'm here, I'm alive, I'm ready to work." Beth came running from the house, her coat thrown over her nightgown, and she stopped in the doorway of the shed, watching Wyatt sit on that old tractor with tears running down his face. "It runs," he said. "It runs," she agreed. He let it idle for 30 minutes, listening for any knock, any miss, any sign of trouble. There was none. The Farmall M, built in 1952, the year Wyatt was born, was running as smooth as the day it left the factory. Maybe smoother because now it had been touched by someone who cared. Wyatt shut it down, climbed off, walked over to Beth. He held her, his greasy hands careful on her back, and he said something he'd been too scared to say before. "We're going to make it." "I know," Beth said. "I mean it. We're really going to make it." "I know." And in that moment, standing in a freezing shed with a tractor that most people would have scrapped years ago, Wyatt Sullivan believed it. He believed that the old iron had value. He believed that the old ways still worked. He believed that his father had been right. He just didn't know yet how hard it would be to prove it. Spring came late to Iowa in 1972, the ground staying frozen until the 3rd week of March, the mud season stretching into April until farmers started to wonder if they'd ever get into the fields. But when it finally broke, when the soil dried enough to work, Wyatt Sullivan was ready in a way his brothers weren't. Because while Cole had been waiting for the dealership to deliver his new tractor, dealing with back orders and shipping delays, and while Garrett had been in Des Moines pretending to farm while he plotted his exit, Wyatt had been preparing. He'd spent the winter not just rebuilding the Farmall M, but learning the land. Every Sunday after church, when the ground was too frozen to work, he'd walk his 80 acres with a notebook, mapping every low spot, every place where water collected, every patch where the soil changed from the dark loam to the lighter clay. His father had told him once that the land would teach you if you paid attention, and Wyatt was paying attention like his life depended on it, because it did. Beth was 8 months pregnant now, moving slow and careful, her ankles swollen and her back aching. But she still kept the books, still calculated every penny they spent against the harvest they hoped to have. On a Friday night in late March, she sat at the kitchen table with her ledger, while Wyatt cleaned the grain drill in the shed, and she did the math that terrified both of them. $3,000 operating loan from the co-op at 8%, seed cost $2,200, fertilizer and chemicals, going light like Wyatt wanted, still $1,500, fuel for the tractor, maybe $400 if they were careful. That put them at $5,300 in cost before they harvested a single ear of corn. If the crop failed, if the yields were bad, if the price dropped, they'd lose everything and still owe the bank. But if it worked, if Wyatt could prove that the old methods, the light touch on chemicals, the careful rotation, the patience his father had taught him. If all of that still had value in 1972, then they'd make it. They'd pay back the loan, feed their family, and have enough left over to start fixing the John Deere 4020, one step at a time, one season at a time. The baby came on April 23rd, 3 weeks early, at 2 in the morning during a thunderstorm that shook the farmhouse and turned the roads to soup. Wyatt drove Beth to the hospital in the F-150, holding her hand while she breathed through contractions, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the rain. By dawn, they had a son, 8 pounds, 6 ounces, with his mother's eyes and his father's hands, already reaching for things he couldn't yet name. They called him Luke, after Beth's grandfather who'd farmed in Missouri and understood what it meant to work ground that didn't want to cooperate. Wyatt held his son in the hospital room while Beth slept, exhausted, and he made promises the way new fathers do. Promises about providing, about being there, about teaching the boy everything worth knowing. But underneath those promises was a deeper one he didn't speak out loud. He promised that Luke would grow up watching his father keep his word, watching him honor the old ways, watching him prove that a man's value wasn't in what he owned, but in what he could fix with his own 2 hands. The hospital bill came to $780, more than they'd budgeted. But the doctor was a man named Henderson who'd known Thomas Sullivan, who remembered Wyatt as a boy helping his father work on a cultivator that had broken down in the middle of harvest. Dr. Henderson made a deal. Pay $300 now and work off the rest fixing the doctor's own tractor, a 1958 Ford that had been sitting in his barn for 2 years with a blown head gasket. Wyatt took the deal, grateful, and spent the next month dividing his time between his own fields and the doctor's barn, learning that sometimes payment came in forms the bank didn't recognize, but that mattered just as much. By the second week of May, Wyatt had 40 acres planted in corn and 30 in soybeans. He'd left 10 acres near the river untouched, letting them rest, letting the native grasses come back to hold the soil when the water rose. People drove by and saw those 10 acres idle and called it waste. Wyatt called it insurance. His father had taught him that the land needed to breathe sometimes, needed a season off to remember what it was before you asked it to be something else. The Farmall M ran 12 hours a day, pulling the grain drill in straight lines that Wyatt measured with stakes and string because the tractor was too old for the fancy guidance systems the new equipment had. It was slower than Cole's new John Deere, used more fuel per acre, and required Wyatt to stop twice a day to check fluid levels and grease the fittings. But it ran. Every morning it started, every evening it shut down clean, and in between, it did the work without complaint. Wyatt learned its rhythms the way you learn a dance partner. He learned that the engine ran coolest at 1,400 RPM, that pushing it past 1,600 made it burn oil, that the transmission liked to be shifted gently without forcing. He learned to hear the difference between normal diesel clatter and the kind of knock that meant something was wrong. And he learned that when you treated a machine with respect, when you maintained it properly and didn't ask more than it could give, it would work longer and harder than anything built to be disposable. Cole, meanwhile, was the talk of the county. His new John Deere 4430 was a beast, painted in the company's signature green and yellow, equipped with a cab that had heat and air conditioning, a radio, and a seat that felt like sitting in a car instead of on a tractor. He'd bought a 6-row planter that could cover 30 acres a day, more than double what Wyatt could do with the old drill. His fields were planted by the 1st of May, perfect rows measured by laser guidance, seed spacing controlled by computers that adjusted on the fly for soil conditions. The local extension agent did a feature on Cole's operation in the county newsletter, calling him a model of modern agriculture, an example of how technology and efficiency would save the family farm. Cole kept a copy of that newsletter on his refrigerator, showed it to anyone who visited. He was 38 years old and finally getting the recognition he thought he deserved. But what the newsletter didn't mention, what Cole didn't talk about at church or at the co-op, was the payment book that sat in his desk drawer, $40,000 borrowed, $5,800 due every year for 10 years. That meant he needed to clear at least $7,000 annually just to make his payments, before he paid himself anything, before he bought groceries or kept the lights on. It was aggressive, but Cole was confident. With that new equipment, with those higher yields, it would work. It had to work. Garrett's 80 acres sat mostly empty that first year. He'd hired a neighbor to plant it on shares, taking a percentage of the crop instead of working it himself. Garrett spent his weeks in Des Moines, working for an agricultural consulting firm, writing reports about market efficiency and land use optimization. He came back to Iowa on weekends, drove past the farm, saw the corn coming up in neat rows planted by someone else's labor. It was perfect. He was making money without the mess of actually farming, and in a year or two, when land prices peaked, he'd sell to Richard Brennan and be done with it entirely. He thought about his father sometimes, wondered what Thomas would say about the choice he'd made. But Garrett had decided that his father's generation had gotten it wrong, had stayed loyal to dirt and machinery when they should have been thinking about capital and opportunity. The future wasn't in Iowa. The future was in getting out before you got trapped. Summer came heavy and hot, the kind of heat that made the corn grow tall and the beans spread wide. Wyatt worked his fields in the early morning and late evening, avoiding the worst of the sun, and spent the middle hours in the shed working on the John Deere 4020. The engine was apart now, spread across the workbench in carefully labeled groups. Pistons here, rods there, the crankshaft on sawhorses, the blocks stripped down to bare metal. He'd found the problem quickly enough. The previous rebuild, the one his father had done in 1968, had developed a crack in the number 3 cylinder. It wasn't Thomas's fault. The block had been used when they had installed it, already weakened by years of thermal stress. But now Wyatt needed to find another block, and used John Deere 4020 blocks weren't easy to come by in central Iowa in 1972. He called salvage yards from Waterloo to Des Moines, placed ads in the shopper, asked every farmer he knew if they had a parts tractor sitting out behind a barn somewhere. Finally, in late June, he got a lead from a man named Potter, who had a 4020 that had rolled in a ditch back in '69. The tractor was totaled, but the engine had been spared. Potter wanted $300 for the block. Wyatt offered $200 and a day's labor fixing Potter's hay baler. They settled at $250 in half a day, and Wyatt drove the F-150 60 miles to haul the block back in the bed of the truck, the suspension sagging under the weight. The rebuild took him 3 months of evenings and weekends. He cleaned the block with solvent and a wire brush, checked every bearing surface with a micrometer, honed the cylinders to the exact specifications in the service manual. He bought new pistons and rings from a dealer in Cedar Rapids, spent $200 he couldn't afford, and installed them with the precision his father had taught him. When it was done, when he'd torqued every head bolt to exactly 95 foot-pounds and set the valve clearances to 14 thousandths of an inch, he felt like he'd built something more than an engine. He'd built a promise that the old iron could be saved, that obsolete was a choice, not a sentence. But there was no time to install it yet. Harvest was coming, and the Farmall M would have to handle it alone. September arrived with perfect weather, cool nights and warm days. The corn drying down in the fields until the kernels were hard and the moisture content dropped to the sweet spot where you could combine without losing yield to mold or having to pay for expensive drying. Wyatt borrowed a pull-type combine from a neighbor, a 1965 model that was slow but reliable, and spent 12-hour days cutting corn, the Farmall M pulling the combine through rows that had grown taller than Wyatt had dared to hope. The yields surprised him, not because they were good, but because they were better than good. His 40 acres of corn averaged 95 bushels per acre, lower than the county average of 105, but respectable for flood-prone ground that everyone had written off. His soybeans came in at 32 bushels per acre, right at the county average. When he ran the numbers with Beth, sitting at the kitchen table with Luke asleep in a bassinet nearby, they both stared at the total for a long moment. 3,800 bushels of corn at $2.60 per bushel, 9,600 bushels of soybeans at $8.40 per bushel. Total revenue, $17,380. Subtract the operating loan, the seed, the fertilizer, the fuel, and they were left with just under $11,000. From that, they needed to pay property taxes, insurance, household expenses, and start saving for next year's crop. It wasn't enough to get rich, but it was enough to survive. And for Wyatt Sullivan in the fall of 1972, survival felt like victory. Cole's harvest was bigger, flashier, the kind that got mentioned at the co-op and the feed store. His 80 acres yielded 118 bushels per acre, the highest in the county, and his beans came in at 37 bushels per acre. His gross revenue hit $26,000, nearly $10,000 more than Wyatt. The newspaper ran a photo of Cole standing next to his combine, grinning, the caption calling him the future of agriculture. But what the photo didn't show was the ledger on Cole's kitchen table, the one that listed his equipment payments, his operating loan, his lease payment to Mrs. Patterson for the additional 120 acres he'd taken on. When you subtracted all the while, Cole netted $6,200 for the year. Less than Wyatt, who'd farmed half the acres with equipment everyone called junk. Cole didn't talk about that part. He talked about the yields, the efficiency, the way his new planter had optimized seed spacing. He talked about expansion, about leasing more ground, about becoming a real operation. But late at night, when his wife Sarah was asleep and the house was quiet, he'd sit at that table and look at the numbers and feel something he didn't want to name. Not quite fear, not quite regret, but something close to both. The winter of 1972 into 1973 was hard, the kind of cold that froze water pipes and made starting the truck an act of faith. Wyatt spent it in the shed again, installing the rebuilt engine in the John Deere 4020. It was delicate work, made harder by the cold, his hands going numb even in gloves as he torqued bolts and connected fuel lines. Beth would bring him coffee at 8 o'clock at night, find him with a kerosene heater going and a trouble light clamped to the tractor's hood, his breath fogging in the air. "You're going to freeze to death out here," she'd say. "Just one more thing," he'd answer. It became their joke, the thing she'd repeat back to him when he fell asleep at the dinner table, when he came in after midnight with oil on his face and exhaustion in his eyes. Just one more thing. Always one more thing. But by March of 1973, the 4020 was running. Wyatt fired it up on a Saturday morning with Luke, almost 1 year old now, sitting on his lap, and the engine caught on the first try, settled into a smooth idle that made the whole tractor vibrate with restrained power. It was like waking up something that had been sleeping, something that remembered what it was built for and was eager to get back to work. The tractor had cost him $2,400 in parts and 4 months of labor. A new 4020 would have cost $18,000 financed over 5 years. Wyatt had paid cash, owed nothing, and had a machine that he knew intimately. Every bolt and bearing, every quirk and characteristic. It was his in a way that financed equipment could never be, because he'd earned it with his hands instead of his signature. That spring, with 2 working tractors, Wyatt expanded. He planted 60 acres instead of 70, still leaving the 10 near the river fallow, but now he could work faster, cover more ground. The 4020 pulled a 4-row planter he'd bought used for $800 and rebuilt over the winter. The Farmall M handled the lighter work, the cultivation, and the hauling. Together, they made a team that wasn't fast or modern or impressive to look at, but that worked. Cole expanded too, but in the other direction. He leased another 80 acres from a widow named Mrs. Patterson, bringing his total to 280 acres. He bought a bigger planter, took out another loan, and told everyone who'd listen that you had to spend money to make money, that staying small was the same as dying slow. His equipment payments went up to $7,800 a year. His operating costs climbed to $32,000. He needed to gross at least $40,000 annually just to break even. The pressure showed in small ways. He snapped at Sarah over things that didn't matter. He stopped coming to Sunday dinners at his mother's house, always had an excuse about work that needed doing. He drove past Wyatt's farm sometimes, saw those old tractors sitting in the shed, and felt something like anger mixed with envy. Because Wyatt looked happy, Wyatt looked free, and Cole, with all his new equipment and his newspaper features and his reputation as a modern farmer, felt trapped. Garrett made his move in the spring of 1975. Land prices had climbed exactly as he'd predicted, and Richard Brennan was ready to buy. They met at a restaurant in Des Moines, a steakhouse where men in suits made deals over whiskey and handshakes, and Brennan offered Garrett $120,000 for his 80 acres, $1,500 per acre, 40% more than it had been worth in 1971. Garrett didn't hesitate. He signed the papers, shook Brennan's hand, and felt something like relief. He was out, free. No more weekends driving back to Iowa, no more pretending to care about corn yields and weather patterns. He had money now, real money, and he could do what he'd always wanted to do, which was prove that his father's way wasn't the only way, that you could be smart instead of stubborn, and still succeed. The news hit the family like a slap. Maggie Sullivan found out from a neighbor who'd heard it at the feed store, and she called Wyatt on a Tuesday evening, her voice tight with anger and hurt. "Your brother sold to Richard Brennan. Did you know?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment, standing in his kitchen with the phone cord stretched tight, Beth watching him from the table where she was helping Luke with a simple puzzle. The boy was 3.5 now, absorbed in fitting wooden shapes into their slots. "No, Ma, I didn't know." Maggie was crying now, trying not to, but failing. "Your father fought that man for 20 years, and Garrett just handed him the land like it didn't mean anything." Wyatt didn't know what to say. What could you say? That Garrett had made his choice? That it was his land to sell? That sometimes people valued different things and you couldn't force them to care about dirt and legacy when they wanted money and freedom? "I'm sorry, Ma. I know you are, baby. You're the only one who is." Cole found out the same day and drove straight to Des Moines, showed up at Garrett's apartment at 7 in the evening, pounded on the door until Garrett answered. "You sold to Brennan? You sold to that son of a bitch?" Garrett was calm, expected this. "I sold to the highest bidder." "It's business, Cole." "Business? That's Dad's land. That's Sullivan land." "It was my land," Garrett corrected. "And now it's Brennan's. I got $120,000. "What did you get? More debt?" Cole took a swing, missed. Garrett stepped back, didn't try to fight, just waited for his brother to calm down. "Get out of my apartment, Cole, and don't come back." Cole left, drove back to Iowa, and didn't speak to Garrett again for 8 years. For Wyatt, the news was different. He didn't feel betrayed so much as sad. Sad that the farm his father had built was now scattered to 3 owners instead of 1, that the land Thomas had loved was going to be bulldozed for commercial development, that Garrett had chosen money over memory and didn't seem to regret it. But Wyatt didn't call Garrett, didn't drive to Des Moines to confront him. He just kept working, kept fixing the old iron, kept planting the difficult ground, kept proving in small, quiet ways that his father's methods still had value. The years 1973 through 1975 established patterns that would define the Sullivan brothers for the next decade. Cole farmed bigger and bigger, always expanding, always leveraging, always one bad season away from disaster. His yields were impressive, his operation was efficient, and his debt grew like a tumor, silent and steady, waiting for the moment when the market would turn, or the weather would fail, or the bank would decide that aggressive lending had turned into reckless risk. Garrett disappeared into Des Moines, then later to Chicago, investing his money in schemes that sounded good on paper. Agricultural futures, commodity trading, a trucking company that hauled livestock across the Midwest. Some of them made money, some of them lost money, but none of them gave him what he thought they would, which was the feeling that he'd outsmarted the dirt, that he'd proven you didn't need to farm to profit from farming. And Wyatt just farmed. He fixed his tractors when they broke, maintained them so they wouldn't break, and learned every season something new about the land his father had left him. He learned that the low ground near the river, the ground everyone called worthless, actually held moisture better in dry years, that the flooding everyone feared actually deposited rich silt that made the soil better over time. He learned to read the weather not from forecasts, but from the way the corn leaves curled in the evening, the way the cattle bunched up before a storm, the way the light changed when the pressure dropped. He learned to be patient, to fix what was broken instead of replacing it, to value knowledge over equipment, experience over efficiency. And he learned that the hardest part of farming wasn't the work. It was the isolation, the way choosing a different path meant standing apart from everyone who thought they knew better. But he had Beth, who believed in him even when the numbers were tight, who kept the books and found ways to stretch every dollar, who reminded him on the hard days that they'd made it this far and could make it further. And he had Luke, growing up in the fields, riding on the tractor fender when he got a bit older, learning to hand his father wrenches before he could spell his own name, absorbing lessons that didn't come from school, but from watching his father refuse to quit. By the fall of 1975, Wyatt had paid off his operating loans every year, had saved enough to buy a used grain trailer for hauling corn, and had built a reputation as the man who could fix anything mechanical. Neighbors started bringing him their broken equipment, offering cash or trade, and Wyatt would work on it in the evenings, building a side income that supplemented the farm. He never advertised, never called himself a mechanic. But word spread the way word does in small communities, And soon there was always something in his shed waiting to be fixed. Always someone willing to pay for the knowledge his father had given him. The summer of 1975 was when things started to change, though none of them knew it yet. The economy was shifting, inflation starting to climb, fuel prices jumping after the oil embargo. The costs that farmers had learned to predict were becoming unpredictable, and the margins that had always been thin were getting thinner. Cole felt it first. His fuel costs doubled from the previous year, and his fertilizer prices went up 40%. The yields were good, but the revenue didn't increase enough to offset the expenses. For the first time since he'd bought his new equipment, he had to ask the bank for an extension on his payment. Had to explain that he wasn't behind exactly, just needed a little flexibility. The bank gave it to him. Banks were still friendly in 1975, still believed that land values would keep rising, that farming was a safe bet. But Cole could hear something in the loan officer's voice, a note of caution that hadn't been there before, a reminder that flexibility wasn't infinite, that patience had limits. Wyatt felt the cost increases too, but differently. His fuel costs went up, but he was using less fuel to begin with because his tractors were smaller, slower, more efficient. His fertilizer costs climbed, but he'd been using less fertilizer from the start, relying on rotation and letting fields rest instead of pushing them with chemicals. The price increases hurt, but they didn't threaten his survival the way they threatened Cole's. And Garrett, living in Des Moines, didn't feel it at all. He'd sold at the right time, he thought. Got out before the squeeze. He took the $120,000 and put it into a cattle trucking venture with a man named Carl Morrison who promised returns of 20% annually. It sounded perfect. It sounded like the future. It would take 3 more years for Garrett to realize that Morrison was a drunk and a liar, that the trucking company was held together with bad credit and false invoices, that the 20% returns were paid from new investors' money rather than actual profits. But in 1975, Garrett thought he'd won, thought he'd proven that the smart money was in getting out, that his father's loyalty to the land had been admirable but outdated. The divide between his brothers was complete now. Cole, farming big with borrowed money, racing to stay ahead of his payments. Garrett, gone entirely, chasing returns in places that had nothing to do with Iowa soil. And Wyatt, farming small with owned equipment, proving every season that slow and steady wasn't just a saying, it was a strategy. They didn't see each other anymore except at their mother's house on holidays. And even then, the conversations were stiff and careful, avoiding the topics that mattered. Cole didn't mention his debt. Garrett didn't talk about his investments. Wyatt didn't say anything about the quiet satisfaction he felt every time he made a payment in cash, every time he fixed something instead of financed something, every time Luke asked him why their tractors were older than everyone else's, and Wyatt got to answer, because we own them outright, son, and that means something. The fall of 1975 brought a good harvest for both Cole and Wyatt, though good meant different things. Cole's 280 acres yielded strong, and he grossed $46,000, enough to make his payments and feel like he'd survived another season. Wyatt's 60 acres produced steady, and he netted $8,000 after all expenses, enough to buy a used disc harrow and put $2,000 in the bank. They were both still farming, both still Sullivan brothers working Sullivan land, but they might as well have been on different planets for all they understood each other's choices. Winter came early that year, snow by Thanksgiving, the kind of cold that made you wonder if spring was a memory or a myth. Wyatt spent it the way he always did in the shed, working on equipment. This time it was the grain drill, the 1958 International that had been with his father since Wyatt was 6 years old. The seed metering system was worn out, the discs were bent, and the whole frame needed to be straightened and reinforced. He worked on it slowly, carefully, teaching Luke, who was 3.5 now, the names of tools, the reasons you cleaned parts before you reassembled them, the way you treated old equipment with respect because it had earned it. Luke would stand on a wooden crate next to the workbench, handing his father wrenches, and Wyatt would explain what he was doing in simple words, planting seeds of knowledge the way his father had planted them in him. Beth came out one evening, wrapped in a coat, and found them there, father and son, working together in the cold shed with a kerosene heater glowing orange in the corner. "You two are going to freeze," she said. "Just one more thing," they answered together, and Beth laughed, the sound warm in the cold air. She watched them work for a while, this husband who'd chosen the hard road, and this son who didn't know there was an easy one. And she thought about the future, about the farm they were building, not with new equipment, but with old skills, not with borrowed money, but with earned knowledge. It wasn't the future the agricultural magazines wrote about, wasn't the future the government extension agents recommended, but it was theirs, and it was real, and it was built on something solid. As 1975 turned to 1976, the three Sullivan brothers were moving in trajectories that seemed fixed, inevitable. Cole toward expansion or collapse, the line between them getting thinner every season. Garrett toward whatever came next in the city, each investment chasing the one before, each promise of easy money leading to another. And Wyatt towards something quieter but no less certain, a slow accumulation of equipment and knowledge and proof that the old ways still worked if you worked them right. None of them knew that 1976 would be the year everything changed, that the drought coming would test them all in different ways, that the choices they'd made 4 years earlier would determine who survived and who didn't, that the division of their father's land would either be permanent or the beginning of something none of them had seen coming. But that was still months away. For now, in the winter quiet, they each believed they'd chosen correctly, that their path was the right one, that their father would have understood even if their brothers didn't. Only Maggie Sullivan, sitting alone in the farmhouse where she'd raised 3 boys and buried 1 husband, knew better. She'd seen this movie before, had watched other families split apart over land and pride. She knew how it ended if someone didn't do something, didn't step up and remember what actually mattered. She just didn't know yet which of her sons it would be. Though if she'd had to bet, she knew where her money would go. The boy who'd chosen the junk over the cash, who'd taken the worst land and made it work, who'd rebuilt old tractors when he could have financed new ones. That boy understood something his brothers didn't. That inheritance wasn't what you received. It was what you were willing to carry forward, even when it was heavy, even when everyone said to put it down. The drought started in March of 1976, though nobody called it that yet. They just called it a dry spring, the kind that happened every few years, nothing to worry about. But by April, when the fields should have been greening up with winter wheat and the ponds should have been full from snowmelt, the ground was still gray and hard, the creek beds showing rock, and the old farmers at the co-op were starting to use words like concerning and unusual and we better hope. By May, it wasn't hope anymore, it was prayer. Wyatt saw it first in the 10 acres he'd left fallow near the Des Moines River, the ground he'd let rest while his brothers called it waste. The native grasses that should have been knee-high by mid-May were barely ankle-tall, brittle and pale, and when he walked out there on a Sunday after church with Luke holding his hand, the dirt cracked under his boots like old leather. The river itself was lower than he'd ever seen it, exposing sandbars that had been underwater since before his father bought the land. He stood there with his son, both of them looking at the slow-moving water, and Luke asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Is it going to rain, Daddy? Wyatt looked at the sky, cloudless and hard as blue enamel, the sun already hot at 9 in the morning. I don't know, buddy. I sure hope so. But hope wasn't a strategy, and Wyatt knew it. That afternoon, while Beth took Luke to her mother's house, he walked every acre of his 80, looking at the soil moisture, checking the places where water usually collected. They were dry, not just surface dry, but deep dry, the kind where you could dig down 6 inches and still find nothing but powder. He'd planted 40 acres of corn in late April, betting on rain that hadn't come. The seeds were in the ground, but they weren't germinating, weren't finding enough moisture to crack their shells and push out roots. Another week without rain, and he'd have to replant, spend money he'd budgeted carefully on seed he'd already bought once. 2 weeks and it wouldn't matter. The season would be too short. The window closed. That night, he pulled out the irrigation plans he'd been thinking about for 2 years, sketches he'd made based on a system he'd seen at a farm show in Ames. PVC pipe and a used pump, gravity-fed from the river, spreading water across the fields in measured amounts. It wasn't fancy, but it would work. The problem was cost. $2,000 for materials, maybe more, and that was if he did all the labor himself. He showed Beth the drawings after Luke was asleep, spread them across the kitchen table next to her ledger where she kept track of every dollar they spent and earned. She looked at the numbers he'd written, the cost estimate, the timeline for installation. We don't have $2,000, Wyatt. I know. Even if we drain the savings, we'd have maybe $1,800, and that's supposed to be for emergencies. Wyatt looked at the drawings, at the careful lines he'd measured and remeasured. Beth, if this drought keeps up, if we lose the corn crop, that's not an emergency, that's bankruptcy. The operating loan is due in October. If I don't have a harvest to pay it with, we lose everything. Beth was quiet for a long moment, her finger tracing the numbers in her ledger. What if it rains next week? What if we spend the money and then we didn't need to? Then we'll have an irrigation system for the next drought. Because there's always a next drought. She looked at him. This man who'd chosen old equipment over new, difficult land over easy, who'd proven for 5 years that patience and work could substitute for money and luck. And she made the decision that would define them both. Build it, we'll find the money somewhere. Wyatt started the next morning, Sunday be damned, and by Monday he had 3 neighbors helping him, men who'd heard about his plan at church and figured if Wyatt Sullivan was worried enough to irrigate, maybe they should be too. They worked in the heat, digging trenches for pipe, hauling the pump from the river to the field, connecting joints with PVC, cement that dried so fast in the dry air you had to work quick or start over. Luke helped, carrying tools, bringing water to the men, learning without knowing he was learning that when the land was in trouble, you didn't wait for someone else to fix it. You fixed it yourself, with whoever would stand beside you. The system was ugly, a tangle of white pipes snaking across the field like some kind of industrial art project. But when Wyatt fired up the pump on a Wednesday afternoon and water started flowing through the lines, when the sprinkler heads began to turn and throw water in wide circles that caught the sunlight and made rainbows in the air, every man there stopped working and just watched. It was like making rain, like taking the thing you couldn't control and controlling it anyway through pure, stubborn refusal to accept that nature got the only vote. The corn came up. Slow, later than it should have, but it came. Green shoots pushing through the cracked earth, finding the moisture Wyatt was giving them twice a day, early morning and evening, when the evaporation was lowest and the water could soak deep. By the end of May, he had a stand, not perfect, but good enough, and the relief he felt was so intense it almost hurt. But the drought wasn't done. June came hotter than April, hotter than May, temperatures pushing past 95 day after day, the corn curling its leaves by afternoon to conserve moisture, uncurling at night when the heat finally broke. The beans he'd planted were struggling, even with irrigation, their leaves yellowing at the edges from heat stress. Wyatt ran the pump 16 hours a day, burning fuel he hadn't budgeted for, wearing out equipment faster than he'd planned. The math was terrifying. Every gallon of diesel cost more because of the oil embargo, and he was burning 30 gallons a day just to keep the pump running. But stopping wasn't an option. Stopping meant watching the crop die, meant admitting defeat to a drought that seemed to have no end. Cole was facing the same drought on different ground and with different resources, and the difference was starting to show in ways that kept him awake at night. His 280 acres were spread across 3 parcels, the original 80 plus the 2 leases he'd taken on, and they weren't all near the river. The northern section had a well, but it was pulling up water so full of minerals it left white crusts on the leaves. The southern section had no water access at all, was dependent entirely on rain that wasn't coming. He'd invested in his equipment, in his expansion, in the things that made him efficient when the weather cooperated. But he hadn't invested in irrigation, hadn't thought it was necessary in Iowa where rain was supposed to be reliable. Now, watching his corn struggle and his beans fail, he was learning the hard lesson that efficiency means nothing when the fundamental inputs disappear. His fuel costs were killing him. The new tractor, with its bigger engine and its air-conditioned cab, used 40% more diesel per acre than Wyatt's old Farmall M. His fertilizer costs, already high because he pushed his ground hard every year, had doubled since 1974. The lease payments to Mrs. Patterson and the other landlord came due whether he had a crop or not. And underneath all of it, constant as a heartbeat, was the equipment debt, $5,800 a year, every year for 6 more years. By July, Cole was behind on his payments. Not drastically, not enough to trigger immediate action, but enough that the bank called. A loan officer named Frank Kowalski, a man with a thin mustache and eyes that had seen too many farmers overextend, asked Cole to come in for a meeting. They sat in a wood-paneled office that smelled like old coffee and anxiety, and Frank spread Cole's file across the desk. "You're 40 days past due on your June payment. That's not like you, Cole. Cole sat with his hands folded, trying to look confident when he felt anything but. I'm having a cash flow issue. The drought's been hard, but I've got crop insurance, and once we get some rain, the yields will come back. Frank looked at him over reading glasses that had slipped down his nose. Cole, crop insurance doesn't pay out on drought unless it's total loss. You're going to have a crop even if it's not a good one. And that means you're going to have income even if it's not enough income. The question is whether it's enough to catch up on your payments. It will be. Frank closed the file, leaned back in his chair. I hope you're right, because I'm looking at your total debt load here, equipment plus operating loan plus your lease obligations, and you're leveraged at about 73%. That's aggressive even in good years. In a drought year, it's dangerous. Cole felt his jaw tighten. Are you calling my loan? Not today. But I need you to understand that the bank's position has changed since you took out this equipment loan. We're seeing a lot of stress in the ag sector. A lot of farmers who expanded in the early 70s when land was cheap and credit was easy. Now costs are up, yields are uncertain, and the banks are getting nervous. I'm not saying we're going to pull the plug. I'm saying you need to have a plan for what happens if this drought continues into next year. It won't. You don't know that. Cole left the bank feeling like he'd been gut punched, like someone had told him a secret about his own life that he hadn't wanted to hear. He drove home in his pickup past Wyatt's farm where he could see the irrigation sprinklers throwing water in wide arcs, and he felt something he hated feeling. Envy mixed with anger, mixed with the bitter knowledge that his younger brother, the one everyone had called foolish, had prepared for this in a way Cole hadn't. That night, he sat in his kitchen with his wife, Sarah, and he told her the truth he'd been avoiding for months. We're in trouble. Sarah looked up from the dishes she was washing, her hands still in the soapy water. How much trouble? If this harvest fails, if we don't gross at least 30,000, we can't make our payments. And if we can't make our payments, the bank starts calling loans. And if the bank calls loans, we lose everything. Sarah dried her hands slowly, came and sat across from him at the table. What can we do? Cole didn't answer for a long time. Finally, he said the thing he'd been thinking for weeks, but hadn't had the courage to say out loud. I could ask Wyatt for help. The words hung there between them, heavy and complicated. Sarah reached across and took his hand. Would he help? Cole laughed, bitter. Yeah, he would. That's the worst part. I called him a fool for taking that old equipment, and now I'm going to have to ask him to save me with the money he made using it. Then ask. Pride doesn't pay bills, Cole. But Cole didn't ask, not yet, because asking meant admitting he'd been wrong, and Cole had spent 5 years being right, being the modern farmer, being the example. Admitting failure now felt like admitting his whole approach had been a mistake, and he wasn't ready for that. August came with heat that felt personal, like the sun had decided to punish Iowa specifically. Temperatures hit 103, 105, and the corn that had been struggling started to die. Not all of it, but enough that you could see the brown patches spreading through the fields like disease, the stalks giving up, the leaves curling into gray husks. Wyatt's irrigation was keeping his crop alive, but barely. The river was so low now that the pump was pulling water that was warm and silty, and he had to clean the filter twice a day to keep it from clogging. His fuel costs had blown past his budget by $800, money he didn't have, and he'd started taking on extra repair work in the evenings, fixing neighbors' equipment for cash, sleeping 4 hours a night, and running on coffee and determination. Beth was 6 months pregnant again, their second child due in November, and she was worried in a way she hadn't been with Luke. Worried about money, about the drought, about the way Wyatt looked at the end of the day, hollow-eyed and exhausted. But she kept the books, found ways to stretch every dollar, and believed in him even when believing felt like its own kind of faith. Luke, 5 years old now, understood that something was wrong even if he couldn't name it. He understood that his father worked more than other fathers, that their tractors were older, that they didn't have things some of his friends at school had. But he also understood, in the way children understand things without words, that his father was fighting for something that mattered, that the old tractors and the long hours in the irrigation system were part of a bigger story about not giving up. On a Saturday afternoon in mid-August, Cole showed up at Wyatt's farm. It was the first time he'd been there in almost a year, and he sat in his truck for 5 minutes before getting out, trying to find the words for what he needed to say. Wyatt was in the shed, rebuilding the carburetor on the Farmall M, when he heard the truck pull up. He walked out, wiping his hands on a rag, and saw his brother standing in the yard looking smaller than Wyatt remembered. Cole, Wyatt, they stood there in the heat, two men who'd come from the same place and ended up in different worlds, and the silence stretched until Cole finally broke it. I need to talk to you. They sat on the porch of Wyatt's house, Beth bringing them iced tea before disappearing inside to give them privacy. Luke was in the yard playing with a toy tractor, and the sound of the irrigation pump was a constant background rhythm, water being thrown across the field in defiance of the sky. Cole took a drink of his tea, set the glass down, looked at his hands. I'm going under, Wyatt. The drought's killing me. My yields are going to be down 60%, maybe more. I can't make my payments. Wyatt didn't say anything, just waited. The bank's going to foreclose. Frank Kowalski didn't say it directly, but I could hear it. I've got maybe 90 days before they start the process. And once they start, I lose the equipment, the leased land, maybe my own 80 acres too. How much do you owe? Total, or just what I need to get current? What you need to not lose everything. Cole closed his eyes, said the number he'd been carrying around in his head like a stone. $22,000. That covers the past due equipment payments, brings the operating loan current, and pays enough to the bank that they'll give me time. Wyatt felt his stomach drop. $22,000. He didn't have $22,000. He had his land, his equipment, and about $4,000 in savings that was supposed to cover the baby coming and the winter ahead. Cole must have seen something in his face because he started talking faster. I'm not asking you to give it to me. I'm asking if there's any way you could help me work something out with the bank, maybe co-sign a loan or put up collateral or something. I know I don't deserve it. I know I gave you shit about your choices, and I know I've been too proud to admit you were right and I was wrong. But Wyatt, I'm drowning here, and you're the only person I can ask. Wyatt looked at his brother, really looked at him, and saw what 5 years of pressure and debt and drought had done. Cole's face was thinner, older, and his eyes had a kind of desperation that Wyatt had never seen there before. This was his brother, the one who'd stood over their father's casket and believed he deserved everything because he'd stayed and worked. The one who'd called Wyatt a fool and watched him walk away with the junk equipment. The one who'd built his dream on borrowed money and was watching it collapse. Why should I help you? The question came out harder than Wyatt meant it, but he didn't take it back. Cole flinched, but he met Wyatt's eyes. Because I'm your brother, and because Dad would have done it. That hit something in Wyatt, some deep place where he kept his father's voice and his father's lessons. And he stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, looked out at his fields where the irrigation was keeping the corn alive one day at a time. Dad also said not to split what's meant to work as one. We split it anyway. We took his farm and divided it and went our separate ways. And now you're asking me to put together what we broke apart. Yes, Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Beth had come to the screen door, was standing there listening, and when Wyatt turned to look at her, she gave him the smallest nod, the kind that said, I'm with you, whatever you decide. I can't give you $22,000, Cole. I don't have it. Cole's shoulders sagged, but I can do something else. Something Dad would have understood even if we didn't. Cole looked up, confused. I can put up my land as collateral for your debt. Work out a deal with the bank where we combine operations, farm your 80 and my 80 together, use the equipment I've got, split the profits, and pay down your debt together. Cole stared at him. You'd risk your farm for me after everything I said? Wyatt came back, sat down next to his brother. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because Dad said the gear stays together, and I think he meant the family too. We split it all, but we don't have to break it. Cole put his head in his hands, and for the first time since their father died, Wyatt saw his older brother cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shaking of the shoulders, tears falling onto the weathered wood of the porch. Why, Cole asked, why would you do this? Because you're my brother, and because I remember what Dad said. We split it all, but we don't have to break it. That night, after Cole left, Wyatt told Beth the full plan. They'd go to the bank together, propose a consolidation. Wyatt's 80 acres would secure a loan that would pay off Cole's past due payments and give them room to breathe. Cole would have to sell his new tractor, the John Deere 4430 that he'd been so proud of, sell it and the other new equipment, use that money to pay down part of the debt. What was left, they'd pay together, farming both parcels as one operation using Wyatt's old equipment. It was risky as hell. If they failed, if the drought continued, or the yields didn't come back, or the markets tanked, Wyatt would lose everything too. His land, his equipment, the future he'd been building for 5 years. And he'd do it trying to save a brother who'd called him a fool. Beth looked at him across the kitchen table, her hand on her pregnant belly. You're sure about this? No, but I'm sure that not trying is worse than failing. What if Cole can't do it? What if he's not willing to give up the new equipment to farm the old way? Then we'll find out real fast. But I think he's scared enough now to try anything. Beth reached across, took his hand. Your father would be proud of you. I don't know about that, but I know he wouldn't want to see one of his sons lose everything because the other two wouldn't help. Monday morning, Wyatt and Cole sat in Frank Kowalski's office, and Wyatt laid out the plan. He put up his 80 acres, free and clear, as collateral against Cole's debt. Cole would liquidate his new equipment, use the proceeds to pay down the principal. The remaining balance would be restructured as a joint loan, both brothers liable, with a 5-year payment schedule. Frank listened, made notes, and when Wyatt finished, he took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Mr. Sullivan, do you understand what you're proposing? You're putting your unencumbered land at risk for your brother's debt. If this doesn't work, you both lose everything. I understand. And Cole, you're willing to sell the equipment you bought? The tractor, the planter, all of it? Cole nodded, his voice rough. Yes. Frank looked at them both, these two brothers who'd taken such different paths and were now trying to find a way back together. I need to run this by the loan committee, but I'll tell you right now, this is the kind of thing we like to see. Family helping family, shared risk, shared reward. If you're both committed, I think we can make it work. There's one more thing, Wyatt said. Frank raised an eyebrow. Cole needs to understand that if we do this, we do it my way. Old equipment, lower costs, slower growth. No more expansion, no more leverage. We farm what we can with what we have, and we don't borrow another dollar until this debt is paid. Frank looked at Cole. Can you live with that? Cole met Wyatt's eyes, and in that moment, all the pride, all the competitiveness, all the need to be the bigger farmer and the modern example fell away. Yes, I can live with that. But Frank wasn't done. There's one condition from the bank's side. We need a public acknowledgement. This isn't just a business transaction. This is a family reconciliation, and the community needs to know it's real. What do you mean? Wyatt asked. I mean, Cole needs to apologize. Publicly. At church, in front of the congregation. He needs to acknowledge what you're doing for him and ask for forgiveness. Cole went pale. You want me to humiliate myself in front of the whole town? Frank's voice was firm. I want you to show humility in front of the people who'll be watching to see if this works. Half the farmers in this county are in the same position you are, Cole. They're overextended, underwater, one bad year from foreclosure. They need to see that there's a path back that doesn't involve pride. They need to see that asking for help is stronger than pretending you're fine. The office was quiet. Outside, the heat was pressing down on the streets of the town, the drought continuing its slow strangulation of the county. Inside, two brothers and a banker were negotiating not just money but meaning, not just debt but dignity. Wyatt spoke quietly. You don't have to do this, Cole. We can find another way. Cole shook his head. Number. Frank's right. If I'm asking you to risk everything for me, the least I can do is admit I was wrong. In front of everyone. They shook hands on it, all three of them, and walked out of the bank into the brutal heat of August in a drought year. The plan was set. Cole would sell his equipment at auction the following week. The money would pay down his debt. Wyatt would sign the papers, putting his land up as collateral. And on Sunday, Cole would stand in front of St. Michael's Church and do the hardest thing he'd ever done. Tell the truth. Sunday came with the sky still cloudless, the temperature already pushing 90 at 9 in the morning. St. Michael's was full, over 150 people crammed into pews that were too warm, fanning themselves with the programs, waiting for the service to start. Word had spread that something was happening, that Cole Sullivan was going to make some kind of announcement, and in a small town in a drought year, anything that broke the routine was worth showing up for. Wyatt sat in the front row with Beth and Luke, his mother Maggie next to him. She'd aged in the 5 years since Thomas died, her hair completely white now, her hands spotted and thin, but her eyes were sharp and she'd squeezed Wyatt's hand when they sat down, whispered in his ear. You're doing the right thing. I hope so, Ma. Pastor Raymond Hayes gave the sermon, talking about forgiveness and family, about the way pride separated people and humility brought them back together. It was clear he knew what was coming, had probably helped plan it, and when he finished speaking, he looked down at Cole sitting in the third row. Cole Sullivan has asked to address the congregation. Cole stood up, walked to the front, and turned to face everyone he knew. His wife Sarah, his neighbors, the men he'd competed with at the co-op, the farmers who'd envied his new equipment and his expansion, the loan officer who'd approved his loans, the community that had watched him rise and was now watching to see how he fell. His voice shook when he started speaking. 5 years ago, when my father died, I thought I knew what it meant to be a farmer. I thought it meant having the newest equipment, farming the most acres, producing the highest yields. I thought it meant being modern, being efficient, being better than the old ways. He paused, swallowed. I was wrong. And my brother Wyatt tried to show me, but I was too proud to see it. When Wyatt chose to take our father's old equipment instead of cash, I called him a fool. When he took the worst land and made it work, I told myself it was luck. When he farmed small while I farmed big, I believed I was smarter. Cole's voice cracked, but I wasn't smarter. I was just more willing to borrow money I couldn't pay back. And now I'm standing here because my brother, the one I called a fool, is the only reason I'm not losing everything. He looked directly at Wyatt. Wyatt is putting his land, his future, his family's security on the line to save me from my own pride. And before he does that, before this community watches us try to make this work, I need to say something I should have said 5 years ago. Tears were running down Cole's face now. I'm sorry, Wyatt. I'm sorry for calling you a fool. I'm sorry for thinking I was better than you. I'm sorry for not seeing that you understood something I didn't. That value isn't in shine, it's in what holds together under pressure. You held together, I fell apart, and I'm asking you to forgive me. The church was absolutely silent. Wyatt stood up, walked to the front, and without a word pulled his brother into a hug. Cole broke down completely, sobbing into Wyatt's shoulder, and Wyatt held him, this older brother who'd been so certain and was now so broken, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, I forgave you a long time ago. Welcome home. The congregation erupted, not in applause because you don't applaud in church, but in something deeper, a collective exhale, a sense that something true had happened, that pride had been laid down and picked up by grace. In the back row, unnoticed by almost everyone, Garrett Sullivan sat alone. He'd driven in from Des Moines that morning, had heard through the family grapevine what was happening, and had come to see if it was real. He watched his brothers embrace, watched the community rally around them, and felt something he'd been running from for 5 years. Regret. Not for selling the land exactly, but for selling it to the wrong person for the wrong reasons. For choosing money over memory and discovering that money spent faster than memory faded. He left before the service ended, slipped out the back, drove back to Des Moines. He wasn't ready yet. Wasn't ready to admit he'd made a mistake. Wasn't ready to ask for what his brothers had found, but he'd seen it, and seeing it meant something, even if he didn't know what yet. After church, the family gathered at Maggie's house. Wyatt, Beth, and Luke, Cole and Sarah, Maggie herself moving slowly but smiling, making coffee and setting out the cookies she'd baked that morning. They sat around the same table where they had eaten Sunday dinners for decades, and the conversation wasn't about farming or debt or drought. It was about the harvest coming, about Luke starting kindergarten, about Beth's pregnancy and the baby due in November. It was about family, the way it was supposed to be. That week, Cole's equipment sold at auction. The John Deere 4430 went for $19,000, less than he'd paid, but more than he'd feared. The planter, the grain truck, the other implements brought another $3,200. Together, it gave him $22,200. He paid the bank $22,000 even, bringing his past due accounts current, and kept the $200 in his pocket like a reminder. A reminder of what he'd had and what he'd let go and what he'd learned in the process. Wyatt's land became collateral for the remaining debt, $36,000 restructured over 5 years at 7% interest. The payments would be $7,200 annually, split between them, payable from the profits of their combined operation. They started farming together in September, getting ready for the fall planting season. Wyatt's Farmall M and the rebuilt John Deere 4020. Cole's knowledge of the land and Wyatt's knowledge of the equipment. Two brothers working ground that had been divided, making it whole again, not by legal documents, but by shared labor. The drought finally broke in mid-September, rain coming in slow, steady storms that soaked into the ground instead of running off. The corn that survived began to fill out, and the beans started to recover. It was too late to save the yields, Too late to make 1976 a good year, but it was enough to make it a surviving year. And for Wyatt and Cole Sullivan, working together for the first time in their adult lives, surviving felt like winning. The spring of 1977 came tentative, like the land itself wasn't sure whether to trust the sky again after what the previous year had done. But by April, the rains returned in steady, gentle storms that soaked into the ground instead of running off, and farmers across the county started to believe that maybe the worst was behind them. Wyatt and Cole Sullivan planted their combined 160 acres with a hope that felt different than it had in years past. Not the aggressive confidence Cole had farmed with before, and not the quiet determination Wyatt had carried alone. This was something new. This was partnership. They worked the fields together, Wyatt on the Farmall M pulling the grain drill, Cole on the rebuilt John Deere 4020 with the 4-row planter. The tractors were both older than most of the equipment in the county, both painted in colors that had faded to something close to primer gray, but they ran. Every morning they started, every evening they shut down clean, and in between they did the work without the drama of breakdowns or the anxiety of payments that couldn't be made. Cole was learning to farm the way Wyatt had been farming all along, slower, more careful, watching the ground instead of the market reports, listening to what the land needed instead of what the agricultural consultants said it should produce. It was harder than he'd expected, this letting go of control, this trusting that enough was actually enough. But every time he wanted to push harder, to plant closer, to add more fertilizer, he'd see Wyatt shaking his head. And he'd remember the church, remember standing in front of everyone and admitting he'd been wrong. That memory kept him humble in ways nothing else could. Beth Sullivan gave birth to their second child on November 12, 1976, a daughter they named Emma after Wyatt's grandmother who'd homesteaded in Iowa back when the land was still being broken for the first time. The delivery was easier than Luke's had been, and the hospital bill was $640, paid in cash from the small profit they'd made even in the drought year. Dr. Henderson had smiled when Wyatt counted out the bills, told him it was good to see a man pay his debts on time. Luke, now 4.5 years old, became his father's shadow whenever he wasn't playing with the neighborhood children. He'd ride on the tractor fender, hand his father tools in the shed, ask questions that showed he was paying attention to things most kids his age ignored. Why does the Farmall sound different than the John Deere? Why do we grease the fittings every day? Why can't we buy a new tractor like Tommy's dad has? Wyatt answered every question the same way his father had answered his, with patience and truth and the understanding that what he was really teaching wasn't mechanics, it was values. The Farmall sounds different because it's a different engine, son, but they both get the job done, We grease the fittings because prevention is cheaper than repair, and we don't buy new because we don't need new, and because not needing new means we're free. That last answer, the one about freedom, was the one that mattered most. Luke didn't understand it fully, not at 4.5, but the seed was planted. The idea that owning something outright, even if it was old and required work, was worth more than having something shiny that owned you through debt. The first year of their partnership, 1977, tested them in ways the drought hadn't. Not with disaster, but with the slow, grinding work of learning to cooperate. Cole was used to making decisions alone, used to being the boss of his own operation. Wyatt was used to working at his own pace, used to the quiet autonomy of a small farm. Putting them together meant collision. They argued about everything, about when to plant, what varieties of seed to use, how much fertilizer to apply, when to cultivate, how often to check the equipment. Cole wanted to push, to maximize, to extract every possible bushel from every acre. Wyatt wanted to sustain, to maintain, to ensure that this year's crop didn't compromise next year's soil. The arguments happened in the field, in the shed, at Maggie's kitchen table over Sunday dinner. They were never mean, never personal, but they were real. Sarah and Beth learned to leave the room when the voices got raised, to let the brothers work it out themselves. The breakthrough came in late May, when they couldn't agree on fertilizer application rates. Cole wanted 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, the standard recommendation. Wyatt wanted 90, believing the soil could provide the rest if they let it. They fought for 2 days, neither willing to back down, until finally Beth made a suggestion. Try both. Split the field, Cole's way on half, Wyatt's way on the other. See what happens. It was so simple it felt like cheating. But they did it. 80 acres with heavy fertilizer, 80 acres with light. Same seed, same planting date, same everything except the nitrogen. By August, they had their answer. Cole's high-input acres yielded 112 bushels per acre. Impressive. Above county average. The kind of number that would look good in the Agricultural Extension newsletter. But the fertilizer cost $180 per acre. And when you subtracted that from the revenue, the profit per acre was $144. Wyatt's low-input acres yielded 98 bushels per acre. Lower than Cole's, lower than the county average, nothing to brag about at the co-op. But the fertilizer cost only $95 per acre, and the profit per acre came out to $151. $7 more per acre by producing less and spending less. It was everything Wyatt had been trying to tell Cole for 6 years, proven not by argument but by arithmetic. Cole stood in the field on a September afternoon looking at the two sections, the numbers written in Beth's neat handwriting on a piece of paper he held in his hand. He read them 3 times, checking the math, looking for the mistake. But there was no mistake. Less had made more. He walked over to where Wyatt was greasing the John Deere, held out the paper. You were right. Wyatt looked up from the grease gun, read the numbers. It's not about being right, Cole. It's about what works. But you were still right. About the fertilizer, about the equipment, about all of it. I spent 5 years doing it wrong. And you tried to show me, and I wouldn't listen. Wyatt set down the grease gun, stood up, put a hand on his brother's shoulder. You're listening now. That's what matters. The harvest of 1977 was good. Not spectacular, not record-breaking, but solid. Their combined 160 acres produced enough revenue that after paying operating costs and making their first debt payment of $7,200, they each cleared $6,000. It wasn't enough to get rich, but it was enough to live on, enough to save a little, enough to prove that the partnership could work. More importantly, it proved that Wyatt's methods weren't just surviving strategies, they were thriving strategies. Low input, high maintenance, patient growth. The old ways weren't old because they were outdated. They were old because they'd been tested long enough to prove they worked. Cole started telling people at church and the co-op that he and Wyatt were farming together now, and the response surprised him. Instead of pity or judgment, he got respect. Farmers who'd watched his near collapse with private satisfaction now looked at him like he'd done something brave. Because admitting you were wrong, asking for help, changing course, those were harder than just failing quietly and selling out. One old farmer named Peterson, a man who'd been farming since the Depression and had seen every kind of disaster, pulled Cole aside after a church service in October. What you and your brother are doing, that's the future. Not the fancy equipment, not the big operations. The family farms that figure out how to help each other instead of competing, those are the ones that'll still be here in 20 years. Cole carried those words with him through the winter, through the long nights of equipment maintenance and planning for the next season. He'd lost his pride in the church, but he was finding something better. Purpose, the understanding that farming wasn't about being the biggest or the best. It was about being sustainable. And sustainability meant community, meant family, meant the willingness to admit you didn't have all the answers. The winter of 1977 into 1978 was when Beth had her idea. She'd been keeping the books for both families now, tracking every expense and every dollar of revenue, and she'd noticed something in the irrigation costs from 1976. Wyatt had spent $2,800 on fuel that year running the pump, money they hadn't budgeted, money that had cut deep into their margins. If another drought came, if they had to irrigate again, that cost could cripple them even with the two families sharing expenses. She spent 3 months researching, reading books from the library about irrigation efficiency, talking to extension agents, writing to agricultural colleges. She learned about pressure systems and gravity feed, about water loss from evaporation, about the difference between flood irrigation and drip irrigation and everything in between. In February, she presented her findings to Wyatt and Cole at the kitchen table, spreading out diagrams and calculations she'd done in her neat, precise handwriting. We're wasting water. The current system, the way you set it up in 1976, it works, but it's inefficient. 30% of the water evaporates before it reaches the roots. Another 20% runs off because we're applying it too fast. Wyatt looked at the diagrams, trying to follow her logic. So what do we do different? We redesigned the system. Instead of high-pressure sprinklers that throw water in the air, we use low-pressure drip lines that put water directly at the base of the plants. We add a small storage pond here, she pointed at the map, where we can pump during off-peak hours and let gravity do the work during the day. And we install moisture sensors so we're only watering when the soil actually needs it. Cole was skeptical. How much would that cost? Beth had the number ready. $2,000 in materials. But it would cut our water usage in half and reduce fuel costs by 60%. In a drought year, it would pay for itself in one season. Wyatt looked at Cole, saw the old hesitation there, the instinct to say it was too expensive, too risky. But then Cole surprised him. If Beth says it'll work, it'll work. She hasn't been wrong about the numbers yet. They built the system together over March and April, the three of them plus Sarah helping on weekends. They dug the pond with a borrowed excavator, laid the drip lines by hand, installed sensors that Cole had to read the manual 3 times to understand. Luke and Emma, too young to help with the heavy work, brought water to the adults and asked questions that got answered between tasks. By May, the system was finished. It looked like something a college agricultural program might have designed, professional and planned, and it had cost exactly $1,947. Beth had budgeted $2,000, and she'd been within $53, a margin of error so small it made Wyatt shake his head in admiration. We should put you in charge of everything, he told her. You couldn't afford me, she answered, smiling. The spring of 1978, it was wet, normal rainfall returning after 2 years of extremes. They didn't need to use the irrigation system at all, and some of the neighbors who'd heard about it asked why they'd spent the money if they weren't going to use it. Beth's answer was simple. Because we're not building for this year, we're building for the year we don't see coming. The harvest of 1978 was strong, yields up across the board, and they made their second debt payment ahead of schedule, clearing $7,200 in October instead of December. The remaining debt was down to $21,600, and for the first time since the partnership started, both families felt like they could breathe. Cole bought a used grain trailer for $1,800, paid cash, and felt a satisfaction he'd never gotten from financed equipment. It wasn't new, wasn't impressive, but it was his. Wyatt rebuilt the baler, the New Holland that had been jamming for years, spent 2 weeks fabricating a new cam mechanism that made it run smooth. Together, they were building an operation that worked not because it was modern, but because it was maintained. 1979 came with uncertainty. The economy was struggling, inflation pushing past 10%, interest rates climbing, and the Carter administration talking about grain embargoes and Soviet relations. Farmers were nervous, unsure whether to plant more or plant less, whether to invest or conserve. Wyatt and Cole chose conservation. They planted the same acres they'd planted the year before, used the same modest fertilizer rates, fixed the equipment they had instead of buying new. It turned out to be exactly the right choice, though they didn't know it yet. The summer of 1980 would teach them why. June of 1980 started dry. Not drought dry, not 1976 dry, but dry enough that the old farmers at church started watching the sky with concern. By July, concern had turned to worry. The rain that usually came in thunderstorms throughout the summer simply stopped. The corn tasseled under stress, the beans flowered early, and the grass in the fallow fields turned brown by mid-month. Other farmers in the county started to panic. Those who hadn't invested in irrigation were watching their crops suffer, were calculating the losses they'd take, were calling their banks to explain that this year might be tight. The drought of 1976 was still fresh enough in everyone's memory that the fear was real and immediate. But on the Sullivan farm, the irrigation system hummed to life like it had been waiting for this moment. Beth's design worked exactly as she'd calculated. The moisture sensors detected when the soil was getting dry, triggered the pump during off-peak hours when electricity was cheapest, filled the storage pond, and let gravity feed the drip lines during the day. The corn got water exactly when it needed it, in amounts that didn't waste a drop. The fuel costs were manageable, the water usage was efficient, and the crops stayed green while fields all around them were turning brown. People noticed. Neighbors drove past, saw the difference, stopped to ask Wyatt how he'd done it. He'd point them to Beth, who'd started teaching workshops at the library, showing other farm wives how to calculate irrigation efficiency, how to design systems on a budget, how to plan for disasters before they happen. The men would nod politely, thank Wyatt, but you could see some of them struggling with the idea that a woman, a school teacher who'd never farmed a day before she married Wyatt, had figured out something their agricultural degrees and years of experience hadn't shown them. Cole had no such hesitation. He'd learned his lesson about pride, and he told anyone who asked that Beth Sullivan was the smartest person in the county when it came to making a dollar stretch and a farm survive. One afternoon in late July, Frank Kowalski drove out to the farm, something he rarely did. He parked his sedan in the yard, got out in his suit and tie, and found Wyatt and Cole working on the disc harrow in the shed. "Gentlemen," he said, "I wanted to see this irrigation system I've been hearing about." They showed him, walked him out to the fields, showed him the drip lines and the sensors in the storage pond, explained Beth's calculations about efficiency and cost savings. Frank listened, asked questions, made notes on a small pad he carried. When they were done, he looked at both brothers with an expression that was hard to read. "You boys know what you've done here? Built an irrigation system?" Wyatt offered. Frank shook his head. "You've proven something the banks need to see. That preparation beats luck. That planning beats hoping. Half the farmers in this county are going to have terrible yields this year because they assumed it would rain. You assumed it might not, and you prepared. That's bankable intelligence." He put his notebook away. "I'm recommending to the loan committee that we accelerate your payoff schedule. You're ahead on your payments, your operation is profitable, and you're managing risk better than farmers with twice your acreage. If you want to pay off the remaining debt early, we'll waive the interest on the final payments." "How much would that save us?" Cole asked. "About $2,800 over the next 3 years. Wyatt and Cole looked at each other, and without speaking, they both knew what the answer was. "We'll do it." The harvest of 1980 was extraordinary, not because their yields were record-breaking, but because everyone else's yields were terrible. The drought had hit hard, and farmers across the county were coming in 30, 40, 50% below normal. But the Sullivan farm, with its irrigation and its careful management, came in at 96% of normal yield. More importantly, the drought had driven grain prices up. Scarcity meant demand, and demand meant money. Their corn sold for $3.40 per bushel instead of the usual $2.60. Their beans went for $11 instead of $8.40. When Beth did the final accounting in November, sitting at the kitchen table with both families gathered around, she announced numbers that made everyone go quiet. After all expenses, after the accelerated debt payment, after setting aside money for next year's operating costs, we netted $18,000. Each family's share is $9,000. Cole put his head in his hands, but this time it wasn't despair. It was relief so profound it felt physical. "We're going to make it," he said. "We're actually going to make it." "We already did," Wyatt answered. "This is just confirmation." That Christmas, they gathered at Maggie's house, the tradition that had been broken for years restored. Luke was 8 now, Emma was 4, and Cole and Sarah had 2 children of their own. The house was full of noise and children and the smell of Maggie's cooking, and for the first time since Thomas Sullivan had died, the family felt whole. Almost whole. Garrett's absence was still there, a gap at the table that no one mentioned but everyone felt. He'd been gone for 5 years now, living in Chicago, chasing investments that seemed to change every time Maggie talked to him on the phone. He sent cards at Christmas, called on birthdays, but he hadn't been back to Iowa since that Sunday in 1976 when he'd slipped into the church and slipped out again. Maggie prayed for him every night, asked God to bring her son home, to show him that the life he was chasing in the city wasn't the life he needed. But she was 70 years old now, and she was starting to accept that some prayers took longer to answer than others. The answer came in September of 1980, on a Thursday evening when Wyatt was in the shed rebuilding the carburetor on the Farmall M. He heard a truck pull up, footsteps approaching, and looked up to see a man standing in the doorway who looked familiar and strange at the same time. Garrett. It had been 5 years, and those years showed. Garrett was 45 now, but he looked older, thinner, his hair going gray at the temples, his eyes carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. He was wearing jeans and a work shirt instead of the business casual clothes Wyatt remembered, and he held a duffel bag like someone who traveled light because he didn't have much to carry. "Hey, Wyatt." Wyatt set down the carburetor, wiped his hands on a rag, didn't move from where he was standing. "Long time?" "Yeah, too long." They looked at each other across the shed. Two brothers who'd chosen different paths and were now standing in the space between them, trying to figure out if there was a bridge back. I heard about what you and Cole did, the partnership, saving the farm. Word travels. Garrett set down the duffel bag, leaned against the doorframe like he needed the support. I made some mistakes, Wyatt. Big ones. The cattle trucking company I invested in, it went bankrupt. Turned out the guy running it was cooking the books, using new investor money to pay old investors. I lost everything. The $120,000 from selling the land, all of it, gone. Wyatt kept his face neutral, waiting. I'm not here to ask for money. I know I don't have any right to ask you for anything. I just wanted you to know that you were right. About the land, about the old ways, about all of it. I thought I was being smart, getting out before I got trapped. But I was just running. And now I don't have anywhere left to run to. Wyatt picked up a wrench, turned it over in his hands. The same gesture his father used to make when he was thinking. What do you want, Garrett? A job, a place to stay, a chance to learn what I should have learned 10 years ago. Wyatt looked at his brother, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't seen before. Humility. The same humility Cole had shown on that church porch 4 years ago. The humility that came from hitting bottom and realizing the only way out was to ask for help. We don't have ownership to offer. The farm belongs to me and Cole, and the debt, what's left of it, is ours to pay. But we could use help, someone to work the fields, maintain the equipment, do the things that 2 families and 160 acres require. What would I get? $400 a month, a room in the old equipment shed, we can fix it up, meals with the family, and the chance to be part of something instead of alone. Garrett's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve this. No, you don't. But Dad used to say family isn't about deserving. It's about deciding. We decided a long time ago that the Sullivan farm was worth saving. I'm deciding now that my brother is worth saving too. Garrett broke down then, crying in a way Wyatt had never seen him cry. And Wyatt crossed the shed and hugged him. This prodigal brother who'd sold his inheritance and lost it all, and come back with nothing but regret and hope. Welcome home, Wyatt said. That night, they told Cole. He was hesitant at first, the old anger still there under the surface. The memory of Garrett selling to Richard Brennan still raw. But Sarah reminded him of something he'd said in church 4 years ago, about asking for forgiveness. And Cole realized he couldn't withhold from Garrett what Wyatt had given to him. He can stay, but he works. Same as us. No special treatment. I wouldn't expect any, Garrett said. They fixed up a corner of the equipment shed, insulated it, put in a wood stove and a cot and a lamp. It wasn't much, but it was dry and warm, and Garrett treated it like a palace. He worked harder than either brother expected, up before dawn, learning to run the equipment he'd dismissed years ago, asking questions about maintenance and technique, like a man who'd realized he'd wasted years and was desperate to make up for lost time. The children loved him. Luke and Emma, Cole's kids, they'd never had an Uncle Garrett before, and he told them stories about Chicago and the wider world that made farm life seem less isolated, more connected to something bigger. He helped with homework, fixed toys, and slowly, carefully, began to rebuild the relationships he'd abandoned. Maggie cried when she saw her 3 sons working together, all of them finally in the same place, doing the same work. It wasn't the way Thomas had left it, wasn't the unified farm of 240 acres, but it was something maybe more valuable. It was 3 men who'd gone separate ways and found the hard road back to each other. By December of 1980, the remaining debt was down to $14,400. They'd paid $22,000 in just over 4 years, ahead of schedule, ahead of expectations. Frank Kowalski had told them they were his model farmers now, the ones he pointed other struggling operations toward as an example of what family and planning could accomplish. The year ended with snow, deep Iowa snow that covered the fields and made the equipment shed warm and inviting despite the cold outside. Wyatt stood in the doorway one night, watching Luke and Garrett work together on the grain drill, the boy handing tools to his uncle the way he'd handed tools to his father. And he thought about his father's words. The gear stays with the land or it stays together. Split one, you split all, but don't split what's meant to work as one. They'd split it all. The land, the equipment, the family, but they'd found their way back together, not through inheritance, but through choice. Through Cole's humility and Wyatt's sacrifice and Garrett's return. Through Beth's intelligence and Sarah's support and Maggie's prayers. The old iron was still running, the old ways were still working, and the Sullivan family, fractured and repaired, was still farming. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The rain had stopped 3 hours before dawn, but the mud along County Road 47 still grabbed at truck tires like it had something to prove. Wyatt Sullivan sat in his 1979 Chevy pickup, the Ford having finally rusted out in '78, windows down, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. He was looking at a fence line that used to mark where his father's land began. Except now, 10 years after the division, it marked where his and Cole's land worked together. 160 acres farmed as one operation, the boundary lines on the deed mattering less than the partnership that had saved them both. It was November 1981, 10 years since they'd buried Thomas Sullivan. 10 years since three brothers had stood in a barn and divided everything. And in those 10 years, Wyatt had learned something his father had been trying to teach him all along, that the test wasn't in the dividing. It was in the coming back together. He started the truck and headed toward the equipment shed. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But this morning felt different, like something was ending and something else was about to begin. He didn't know yet that his mother had spent the night in pain, that she'd called Dr. Henderson at 4 in the morning, that the answer she'd been waiting for was finally coming. The years between 1981 and 1985 were the building years, the time when the Sullivan brothers proved that partnership wasn't just about surviving crisis, it was about creating something sustainable. They paid off the remaining debt in April of 1982, 18 months ahead of schedule, and Frank Kowalski had driven out personally to shake their hands and tell them they'd done something remarkable. You boys started with 160 acres, 40,000 in debt, and equipment most people would have junked, he'd said. Now you're debt-free, profitable, and half the county is asking how you did it. We worked, Wyatt had answered, and we didn't quit. That's the part most people can't do, Frank had replied. With the debt paid, they expanded carefully. Not with borrowed money, not with new equipment, but with the patient accumulation that Wyatt had practiced from the beginning. They bought an additional 80 acres from Mrs. Patterson's estate in 1983, paid cash, bringing their total to 240 acres. The same amount Thomas Sullivan had farmed, the same amount the brothers had divided, now unified again, not through inheritance, but through the slow, deliberate work of men who'd learned that the only shortcuts worth taking were the ones you built yourself. Garrett became more than hired help during those years. He became essential. The brother who'd left was now the brother who stayed late to finish maintenance, who volunteered for the dirty jobs, who treated every task like penance and opportunity combined. He'd been working for wages since 1980, saving every dollar, and in 1984, Wyatt and Cole made him an offer. Buy-in, $10,000 for a share of the operation. Not ownership of the land, that stays with me and Cole, but a share of the equipment, a share of the profits, a vote in the decisions. Garrett had looked at them across the kitchen table. This offer he'd thought he'd never hear. I don't have 10,000. You have 8,000 saved, Cole said. We know because you asked us to help you open a bank account. We'll lend you the other two, no interest, paid back from your share of the profits. Why would you do this? Wyatt had answered. Because you've earned it, and because Dad would have wanted it. Garrett had cried again, the way he'd cried the night he came home, and the three brothers shook hands on a partnership that made the farm whole in a way the land title never could. Luke Sullivan turned 13 in 1985, tall for his age and already showing the rangy build his father had. He could rebuild a carburetor, set valve clearances, and diagnose engine problems by sound. He could drive the Farmall M in the fields, though technically he wasn't old enough, and he understood equipment maintenance the way some boys understood baseball statistics. Wyatt watched his son work and saw his father's hands, his father's patience, his father's refusal to believe that anything was unfixable. Emma was 9, bright and quick-witted like her mother, already helping Beth with the bookkeeping, learning to read financial statements and calculate profit margins. The farm was teaching both children different lessons, but they were learning together, and that mattered more than any curriculum. Cole's children, Nathan and Rebecca, were learning too, the 4 cousins forming a pack that ranged across the farm like it was their kingdom, which in a way, it was. The inheritance they didn't know they were receiving, the knowledge passed down not through words but through watching, through doing, through the countless small moments when an adult stopped to explain why something mattered. It was February of 1986 when Maggie Sullivan called Wyatt at 6 in the morning. Her voice was thin, strained, and he knew before she said it. "I need you to come, baby. It's time." He drove to the old farmhouse, the one where he'd grown up, where his father had died 15 years earlier. Cole and Garrett met him there, all three brothers gathering around their mother's bed, while Dr. Henderson checked her pulse and her breathing and gave them the look doctors give when there's nothing left to do but wait. Maggie was 75 years old, and she'd been strong up until 2 months ago when the pain started. Cancer, Henderson had told him, already spread too far to treat. She'd refused the hospital, refused everything except the pain medication that let her think clearly enough to say what needed to be said. She lasted 3 more days. 3 days of drifting in and out, of moments of clarity where she'd tell stories about Thomas, about the farm, about watching her boys grow up and split apart and come back together. And on the last day, when the light was failing and her breathing had gone shallow, she'd asked them to bring her the metal box from the closet in her bedroom. The box was old, lockable, the kind that had held important papers back when filing cabinets were for rich people. Wyatt set it on the bed next to her, and Maggie's thin fingers found the key she wore on a chain around her neck. "Your father made me promise not to open this until I was dying, or until 10 years had passed, whichever came first. I kept my promise. Now you need to see what's inside." She unlocked the box with shaking hands, and inside was a single envelope, sealed with wax, marked with Thomas Sullivan's handwriting. "To be opened by my sons together, not before." Maggie closed her eyes. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew you'd split apart, and he knew you'd have to find your own way back." She died that night, quietly, with all three sons holding her hands. They buried her next to Thomas on a cold February morning with snow falling, and half the county came to pay respects to a woman who'd raised three boys alone and lived to see them become men who honored their father's name. After the funeral, after the guests had left and the house was empty, the three brothers sat at the kitchen table where they'd eaten 1,000 meals, and Wyatt opened the envelope. Inside was a letter dated November 10th, 1970, written in their father's careful hand. "My sons, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and time has passed. I don't know if it's been the 10 years I asked your mother to wait, or if she's gone too, and you found this after. Either way, you're older now than you were when I wrote this, and I hope that means you're wiser. I'm dying. The doctors don't know it yet, but I can feel it. I've got maybe a year, maybe less. And I've been thinking about what I'm going to leave you boys. Not just the land and the equipment, but the lesson. I could have written a simple will, divided everything equal, let you go your separate ways, hoped for the best. But I didn't raise you boys to take the easy path, and I'm not going to start teaching it now that I'm almost done. So here's what I did. I wrote a will that split everything 3 ways, fair and legal, and then I wrote a challenge into it, the part about the equipment staying together. I wanted to see which one of you understood what I was really saying. The land is patient. It'll wait for whoever farms it next, but equipment requires attention, requires maintenance, requires someone who knows that value isn't in buying new things, it's in keeping old things running. I'm betting one of you will choose the equipment over the cash. I'm betting that same one will figure out that the old iron isn't the point. The point is the principle, that you maintain what you have, that you don't replace what you can repair, that you value knowledge over credit and craftsmanship over convenience. And here's the real test, the one I couldn't write into the legal will because no lawyer would let me. I'm betting that the son who takes the equipment and keeps it running will also be the son who saves his brothers when they need saving. Because if you understand how to maintain a tractor, you understand how to maintain a family. So here's my actual last will and testament, the one that matters more than the legal one. Whoever has kept the old equipment running for at least 10 years, whoever has proven that the old ways still work, that person has earned the right to the whole farm, all 240 acres. Not because they were the oldest or the smartest or the one who stayed, because they understood what I was trying to teach. But here's the condition, and it's not negotiable. Whoever earns that right has to share it, has to find a way to include his brothers, to make the family whole again, to prove that the lesson isn't about winning, it's about keeping things together that everyone else would let fall apart. I'm guessing it's Wyatt. He's the one who listens to what machinery tells him, who has his grandfather's hands and his mother's heart. But I could be wrong. Maybe it's Cole learning patience from difficulty. Maybe it's Garrett learning value from loss? I don't know. That's why it's a test. If you boys are reading this together, if you're all still talking to each other, then you passed. And if you passed, then take what I'm giving you and make it mean something. Not just the acres, not just the equipment. Make the family mean something. Your father, Thomas Sullivan. The kitchen was quiet for a long time. Outside, the February wind rattled the windows. And somewhere in the distance, a tractor started up. One of the neighbors getting ready for spring work. Wyatt read the letter 3 times, then passed it to Cole, who read it twice and passed it to Garrett. When they'd all read it, when the words had settled into the space between them, Wyatt spoke first. He was right. About me taking the equipment. About keeping it running. About all of it. Cole nodded. You earned it, Wyatt. Fair and square. The farm should be yours. Garrett didn't say anything, just looked at his hands. These hands that had signed away 80 acres for money he'd lost. Hands that had been empty when he came back. Wyatt stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the land his father had worked for 40 years. Dad said whoever earned it had to share it, had to find a way to make the family whole. He didn't say how. That part's up to us. He turned to face his brothers. Here's what I'm thinking. We create something called the Sullivan Family Trust. All 240 acres go into it. The 3 of us are equal trustees. Nobody owns it individually, but we all own it together. The trust can't be sold except by unanimous vote. If one of us dies, his share goes to his kids, but they don't get to sell either. The land stays in the family, period. What about the equipment? Cole asked. Same thing. Goes into the trust. We maintain it together, replace it when we have to, but the principle stays the same. We value what we have, we fix what breaks, we don't borrow what we can't pay back. And the profits? Garrett asked, his voice quiet. Split 3 ways, equal shares. We work together, we profit together, we risk together. Cole looked at Wyatt for a long moment. You'd give up sole ownership after you earned it? Wyatt shook his head. I'm not giving up anything. I'm choosing what Dad wanted, family over property, keeping things together over keeping score. That afternoon, they drove to Cedar Rapids and met with a lawyer named Ruth Morrison, a woman in her 30s who specialized in agricultural law. She listened to what they wanted, read Thomas's letter, and spent 3 hours drafting the documents that would create the Sullivan Family Trust. It's unusual, she said. Most farm trusts are designed for tax purposes or succession planning. This is designed to keep a family from splitting apart. That's exactly what it is, Wyatt agreed. She smiled. Your father was a smart man, and you boys are honoring him the right way. They signed in the papers on March 15th, 1986. All 240 acres, all the equipment, all the accumulated knowledge and maintenance records and parts inventory. Everything went into the trust, and the 3 brothers became equal partners in a way that no division could have achieved. That night, they sat in the equipment shed, the same shed where they'd divided everything 15 years earlier, and they toasted with coffee because none of them drank. And Garrett said what they were all thinking. We should have done this from the beginning. We weren't ready then, Wyatt answered. We had to lose it first to understand what it was worth. The years from 1986 to 1990 were the consolidation years, the time when the Sullivan Family Trust proved that collective ownership could work. They modernized carefully, buying a used John Deere 4440 in 1987, paid quorum, selling the 40200 to a collector who appreciated restored equipment. They kept the Farm All M, though, because it had become more than a tractor. It had become a symbol. Luke Sullivan turned 18 in 1990, graduated from high school, and shocked everyone by announcing he was going to Iowa State to study agricultural engineering. Not because he wanted to leave the farm, but because he wanted to bring new knowledge back to it. I want to learn how to make old equipment run better, he told his father. How to retrofit modern technology onto vintage iron. How to get another 50 years out of machines everyone else throws away. Wyatt had never been prouder. Emma went to college too, studying accounting and business management, planning to come back and run the financial side of the operation. The 3rd generation was preparing to take over, and they were preparing with the same principles the 2nd generation had learned the hard way. But 1990 was also the year the Farm All M finally died. It happened on a Wednesday morning in July. Wyatt was pulling a cultivator through the corn, the tractor doing the light work it had done for 38 years, when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Not a knock, not a rattle, but a grinding, tearing noise that meant something catastrophic had let go inside the engine. He shut it down immediately, coasted to a stop, and climbed off. Oil was pouring out from under the engine, black and thick, and when he looked underneath, he saw the crack. The block had finally given up, split from cylinder to oil pan, a failure so complete that no amount of welding would fix it. He called Cole and Garrett, and they came out to the field, all three brothers standing around the old tractor like it was a fallen soldier. "Can we fix it?" Garrett asked. Wyatt shook his head. "Not this time. The block's done. We could find another one, swap it in, but we'd basically be building a different tractor." Cole put his hand on the fender, the green paint worn down to primer in places, the tin work dented from decades of use. "It's been running since 1952. 38 years. That's longer than most marriages. Longer than most people," Garrett added quietly. They towed it back to the shed, and that Saturday they held a ceremony of sorts. Invited the neighbors, the people who'd watched Wyatt resurrect this tractor back in 1971, who'd seen it work through droughts and good years and everything in between. They parked it under the old oak tree on the south pasture, the same tree where Thomas Sullivan used to sit and eat his lunch, and they mounted a plaque. Farmalim, 1952 to 1990. The tractor that taught us patience, persistence, and the value of maintaining what you have. It carried this farm through its hardest years and proved that obsolete is a choice, not a sentence. Luke, 18 years old and about to leave for college, stood next to his father and looked at the old tractor. "We should rebuild it, someday." Wyatt smiled. "Someday? But for now, we let it rest. It's earned it." The 1990s passed in a rhythm that was both familiar and new. The farm prospered, not through aggressive expansion, but through consistent profitability. They added precision agriculture technology to their newer tractors, GPS guidance systems, and yield monitors. But they added it thoughtfully, keeping the principle of maintenance and longevity even as they accepted modern tools. Luke came back from Iowa State in 1994 with a degree and ideas about retrofitting old equipment with modern efficiency. He designed a hybrid system for one of their older tractors, keeping the mechanical simplicity but adding electronic fuel injection for better mileage. It worked, and he published a paper about it that caught the attention of agricultural magazines and equipment manufacturers. Emma came back the same year with her accounting degree and immediately transformed their bookkeeping into a model of efficiency. She implemented systems for tracking every input cost, every hour of labor, every gallon of fuel, and she used that data to make decisions that saved thousands of dollars per year. The third generation was here, and they were ready. Cole retired in 1998 at 64, his body worn down from years of hard work, but his mind sharp and his pride restored. He spent his retirement working part-time at the co-op, advising younger farmers, telling anyone who'd listen about the year he nearly lost everything and the brother who saved him. Garrett never really retired. He worked until he was 68, until his hands couldn't grip wrenches anymore. And then he worked in the office with Emma, helping her with planning and projections. He'd never married, never had children of his own, but Luke and Emma and Nathan and Rebecca were his, and he treated them that way. And Wyatt kept farming. Even as Luke took over more of the operation, even as his back ached and his hands developed arthritis, he was out there every spring, planting at least one field himself, keeping his connection to the land that had defined his life. It was in the spring of 2000 that they held the ceremony for the farm's renewal. Luke was 30 years old now, married to a girl named Rachel from Cedar Rapids, and they had 2 children. Nathan was 25, working alongside his father Cole in a management role. Emma was 24, CFO of Sullivan Family Trust, making decisions that affected 3 families and 240 acres. They gathered everyone together, 5 adults from the 3rd generation, 9 from the 4th, and they stood in the equipment shed where it had all begun. Wyatt was 58 years old, his hair more gray than brown, his hands scarred from a lifetime of mechanical work. He'd prepared a speech, but when the moment came, he set his notes aside and just talked. 30 years ago, my father died and left us a choice: split apart or find a way together. We chose split because that's what the world told us to do. Fair division, clean break. Everyone gets their share. He looked at his brothers. We were wrong, not because division was unfair, but because it missed the point. Dad didn't care about fair. He cared about keeping something alive. The farm, yes. But more than that, the family, the knowledge, the principle that value isn't in what you buy, it's in what you maintain. He pulled out a set of keys, the keys to the newest tractor, a John Deere 8400 they'd bought the year before. Luke, you're taking over operations. Nathan, you're second in command. Emma, you're running the finances. The three of you, you're the trust now. We're still here, Cole and Garrett and me, but this is yours. Make it mean something. Luke took the keys and his father hugged him, and in that moment, the transfer of 40 years of knowledge happened the way it always does. Not through paperwork, but through respect. Wyatt Sullivan died in the spring of 2005, age 63, from a heart attack that came quick and clean. He was in the field, checking the corn that Luke had planted, when he sat down against a fence post and didn't get back up. They found him an hour later, peaceful, his hand resting on soil he had worked for 34 years. They buried him next to his mother and father, 3 generations of Sullivans in a row, and they played a video he'd recorded 6 months earlier, when the doctor had told him his heart was failing and he had maybe a year. In the video, Wyatt sat next to the Farm All-M, the tractor that had defined his early years, now weathered and rusted under the oak tree. If you're watching this, I'm gone. But before I went, I wanted to tell you what I learned. Not about farming, though I learned that too. About family, about legacy, about what we pass down. He put his hand on the tractor's fender. This machine is old, broken, done. But it did its job. It worked when we needed it, and it taught me that the value of something isn't in how long it lasts, it's in what it does while it's here. He looked directly at the camera. I took the old equipment because everyone said it was worthless. I farmed the bad land because everyone said it was impossible. I saved my brother because everyone said I was a fool. And I did all of it because my father taught me that the hard choice is usually the right choice. His voice got softer. Luke, Nathan, Emma, Rebecca, and all the ones coming after. You're going to face choices, easy paths and hard paths, new and old, debt and discipline. And I can't tell you which to choose because every situation is different. But I can tell you this, the easy path feels good at first and hard later. The hard path feels hard at first and good later. Choose the one you can live with when you're my age looking back. He stood up, the effort visible. And remember, legacy isn't what you leave. It's what you teach people to keep. I'm leaving you land and equipment in a trust fund. But what I taught you to keep is knowledge. The knowledge that broken things can be fixed, that families can be repaired, that the old ways still work if you work them right. The video ended, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church. The epilogue to Wyatt Sullivan's life was written by the people who continued his work. Luke and Nathan farmed the 240 acres using methods that blended old wisdom and new technology. Emma managed finances with the precision her grandmother Beth had taught her. And in 2008, they made a decision that would have made Wyatt smile. They rebuilt the Farm All-M. It took Luke 2 years, working evenings and weekends, sourcing parts from collectors and fabricators, rebuilding the engine with the same patience his father had used in 1971. When he was done, when he fired up that tractor for the first time in 18 years, the sound it made was the sound of everything Wyatt had believed in. That old could be made new. That discarded could be restored. That value was in the work, not the shine. They didn't farm with it. The Farm All-M was too old, too slow, too limited for modern agriculture. But every spring, Luke would start it up, drive it around the farm once, and park it back under the oak tree. A reminder, a testament, a promise kept. The Sullivan Family Trust prospered through the 2010s and into the 2020s. The fourth generation came of age, Luke's children and Nathan's and Emma's, and they learned the same lessons in different ways. Some went to college and came back. Some stayed on the farm and learned by doing. Some left for careers in the city, but came home for holidays and understood that what they were part of was bigger than agriculture. It was family. And family, the Sullivans had learned, was the only thing that really lasted. In 2025, on the anniversary of Thomas Sullivan's death, the family gathered for a reunion. 53 people, 4 generations, all connected by blood and by land, and by the principle that value isn't in what you own, it's in what you maintain. They stood in the equipment shed, the same shed where 3 brothers had divided a farm in 1971. And they looked at the tools that hung on the walls, the tools that had been there for 70 years. And Luke Sullivan, 73 years old now and retired, told his grandchildren the story. About a man who chose old equipment when he could have had cash. About brothers who split apart and found their way back together. About a drought that nearly destroyed them and a partnership that saved them. About a mother who kept a secret and a father who made a test. About legacy and what it really means. And when he was done, when the youngest child asked if the story was true, Luke walked over to the Farmall M, still sitting under the oak tree after all these years, and he put his hand on the fender the same way his father had, the same way his grandfather had, the same way generations would continue to do. Every word, he said. The old iron was still there, the old ways were still taught, and the Sullivan family, tested and proven, was still farming. That was the legacy, not the acres, not the equipment, not even the stories. The legacy was the choosing, the choice to maintain instead of replace, to repair instead of discard, to save instead of abandon, to believe that the hard way was the right way even when everyone said it was foolish. Thomas Sullivan had made that choice in 1927 when he bought the land. Wyatt Sullivan had made it in 1971 when he took the equipment, and every generation since had made it again, in their own way, proving that some things were worth more than money. Family, knowledge, integrity, work. Those were the gears that stayed together. Those were the things that didn't split. And as long as someone chose to maintain them, they would never be obsolete.